You are awake before the bell, but you do not know you are awake because the difference between sleeping and waking in this room is so small it cannot be measured. Your eyes are open, but the darkness is complete enough that you might still be dreaming the darkness, and there is no way to be certain which side of the line you occupy. The ceiling is above you somewhere, and you know it is there because you have seen it every morning for as long as you have been in this house, but right now it is only a pressure of absence above your face, a thick black nothing that holds the cold air against your cheeks. You do not move. Moving would disturb the shape of warmth you have made under the blanket, and the shape is small and hard won, and it belongs to you and the child beside you in equal measure. The child beside you is named Mary, or perhaps it is Anne, or perhaps it is one of the other names that all blur together in the dark, and it does not matter, because her breathing is the only thing that identifies her. She breathes in a pattern you have memorized without ever deciding to memorize anything. In for 3 counts, and then a pause that is not quite a pause because the air only slows on its way out, and then out for 4 counts, and then a longer stillness before the next breath begins. You count these breaths not because you are counting them, but because they are there, and you are there, and the space between you is filled with the sound of them. The sound is soft and a little wet, and it catches on something in her throat every 7th or 8th breath. And when it catches, there is a tiny click that you feel in your own chest, even though you are not touching her except where your shoulders meet under the wool. The blanket is wool and it is grey, and it is rough against your chin where you have pulled it up as high as it will go without uncovering your feet. It smells of sheep still, even though it has been washed many times in the big iron pot with the lye soap that makes the older girl's hands crack and bleed in winter. The smell is not unpleasant. It is only strong and old, and it fills the space under the blanket with the memory of a field you have never seen. You breathe that smell in and out in a rhythm that is slower than Mary's rhythm, and the 2 rhythms do not match. But they do not need to match, because they have been overlapping in this same room for so many nights that they have worn grooves into the air like wagon wheels on a soft dirt road. The plaster ceiling is cracked, but you cannot see the crack yet because the light has not arrived. You know the crack is there. It runs from the corner above the door to the center of the room, where it forks into 2 smaller cracks that look like a river on a map, if you have ever seen a map, which you have not. One of the older boys who left last spring to work for the blacksmith in the next village told you once that the crack looked like a chicken foot, and you thought about that for many nights and decided he was wrong. But you did not say so, because saying so would have required speaking, and speaking was not encouraged after the candle was snuffed. The crack is not a chicken foot. It is a dry riverbed in a country that has forgotten rain. You will see it again when the light comes, and you will think this same thought about the riverbed and the forgotten rain, and you will not know why you think it, except that the mind does strange, slow things in the space before waking. The cold is a thing with weight. It presses down on the blanket and seeps up through the straw of the pallet beneath you, and it finds the places where your body meets the body next to you, and it tries to work its way between you like a thin blade, but it cannot because you are pressed too close, and the warmth of 2 children is just enough to hold the cold at a distance of about 1 finger width from your skin. Your nose is cold. The tip of your nose is the only part of you that has surrendered to the night air, and it is very cold indeed. Cold enough that you can feel the shape of it more clearly than you can feel your own hands, which are tucked somewhere under the blanket in a tangle of limbs that you have stopped trying to identify as yours or Mary's or Anna's or whoever is sleeping on your other side. The ownership of hands and feet becomes unclear in the night, and it does not matter because all the hands are cold anyway, and all the feet are cold anyway, and the only difference is the temperature of the cold, which varies by such small degrees that only the slow attention of a waking mind could notice it at all. The room holds 14 children tonight. You know this because you counted them before sleep as you do every night. A slow count that moves from the door along the wall to the window and back again, and the number is always 14, unless someone is sick and has been moved to the small room off the kitchen where the chimney warmth reaches, or unless someone has left to be apprenticed, and the number becomes 13 until a new child arrives from the parish, and the number becomes 14 until a new child arrives from the parish, and the number becomes 14. The number is stable in the way that water in a bucket is stable even though the water is always being poured out and refilled. You do not know the names of all 14 children because some are too young to speak clearly, and some are too new to have been named to your satisfaction, and some have names so similar to other names that you have stopped trying to separate them in your mind. They are sleeping now, all of them, or nearly all of them, and their breathing makes a sound like a distant sea that you have also never heard but have been told about by the same boy who said the crack looked like a chicken foot. You do not know if the sea is real or if it is a story, like the stories the overseer reads from the big book on Sunday afternoons. And you do not need to know, because the sound of 14 children breathing in a cold room is real enough, and it is the only sea you will ever need. The change begins in the high window. The window is set into the wall opposite the door, and it is small and its glass is thick and wavy and full of bubbles that catch the light in strange ways. The change is not light exactly, but the promise of light, the way the smell of bread is the promise of bread before the loaf is brought to the table. The blackness of the glass becomes a little less black, or rather, it becomes a different kind of black, a black that has grey hidden inside it like a secret. You watch this change without watching it, because your eyes are still open, and they have been open for so long that the watching is just part of the breathing part, of the waiting part of the slow drift from one state to another that happens every morning without your permission or participation. The grey inside the black grows slowly. It grows the way moss grows on the garden wall, and you have watched moss grow on the garden wall, and you know that you cannot see it growing in the moment. But if you look away and look back after a long stillness, you can see that it is spread. The window does this same trick. The grey spreads from the center of the glass outward, or perhaps from the edges inward. It is hard to tell because the glass is so uneven and the bubbles confuse the direction of things. You think about the bubbles in the glass and how they were trapped there when the glass was made by someone who is now dead and buried and forgotten, and the bubbles remain fixed in place for you to look at every morning. The thought is too large for this hour, and it slides away from you like water off oiled wool, and you return to the grey which is now a grey you can name. The grey is the colour of the porridge you will eat in perhaps an hour, or perhaps 2 hours. You do not know the time because there is no clock in the dormitory, and the bell is the only measure of the day. The porridge grey is a soft grey, a grey that has brown in it from the oats and white from the water. And it is the same grey that is now spreading across the ceiling, revealing the cracks you already knew were there. The chicken foot riverbed map crack appears first, because it is the deepest, and the shadow of it holds the dark, longer than the flat plaster around it. Then the smaller cracks appear, one by one, like writing being revealed on a page that was blank a moment ago. You follow the lines with your eyes, and your eyes move slowly because everything moves slowly in this room, and speed is a thing that belongs to the world outside, which you rarely see and do not think about. The plaster has other marks besides the cracks. There is a brown stain in the corner above the window where the roof leaked 3 winters ago, and the water ran down the wall and froze in a long ribbon before the thatch was mended. The stain is shaped like the island of Britain on the map that hangs in the overseer's study, though you have only glimpsed that map once, when the door was left open and you were walking past with a bucket of ashes. The stain is written upside down or perhaps right side up depending on where you are standing, and you are lying down so the orientation is unclear. It does not need to be clear. The stain is just a stain, and it will be there tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, until someone whitewashes the wall, which happens every spring, and yet the stain always bleeds through again by autumn. You think about the persistence of stains, and the persistence of cracks, and the persistence of your own breathing, which continues without your effort or attention. Mary shifts beside you. Her shoulder moves under the blanket and the movement travels through the wool and into your own shoulder, and you feel the shape of her adjust itself against the straw. She makes a small sound that is not a word and not a sigh, but something between them. A sound that means she is also awake, or nearly awake, or in that same unmeasured space you are in. Her breathing changes from the 3-4 pattern to something shallower and faster, and then it settles back into the old pattern, as if she has decided not to wake up yet, and you understand this decision because you have made it yourself many times. The warmth between your shoulders shifts and resettles, and the cold air does not find the gap because you are both practiced at this, and you move together without thought the way water moves around a stone. The window grey has become a grey with yellow in it now. The yellow is thin and watery, and it comes from somewhere beyond the glass, where the sun is rising over the bare fields and the bare trees and the long, low shape of the parish church that you can see from the kitchen yard, but not from this window. You know the sun is rising because this grey-yellow always comes at this time, and it is the only clock you have ever needed. The light touches the top of the window first, because the window is high and set near the ceiling, and the light has to travel down the glass before it can reach the floor. You watch the line of light descend. It moves so slowly that you cannot see it moving, but you can see where it has been and where it is now, and the distance between those two places is a distance you could measure with a held breath if you cared to measure anything. The floorboards appear from the darkness one by one. They are white boards of oak that have been walked on by children's feet for so many years that the grain of the wood stands up in ridges where the softer parts have worn away. The boards are dark brown, almost black, where the dirt and the years have worked into the fibers, and they are lighter brown where the scrubbing with sand and lye has scoured the surface clean. You know every board and every knot and every nail head, because you have looked at them for so many hours of your life that they are more familiar to you than your own hands. The board nearest the door has a knot that looks like a closed eye. The board under the window has a long crack that runs parallel to the wall, and it collects dust and small bits of straw that you sometimes pick out with your fingernail during the afternoon rest hour. The board where the youngest child sleeps has a dark stain that might be old blood or might be spilled broth, and no one remembers and no one asks. The light reaches the first row of pallets now. The pallets are just sacks of straw laid on the floor with no frames to lift them off the cold boards because frames cost money. And money is for things like bread and coal and the overseer's new boots which you saw last Sunday, polished to a shine that hurt your eyes. The straw inside your pallet is old and crushed flat, and it has lost most of its smell, except for a faint, dusty sweetness that reminds you of summer, even though you cannot remember summer clearly because summers all blur together, the way winters blur together, the way everything blurs together in a life that is measured by bells and bowls, and the changing light on the plaster ceiling. A child at the far end of the row coughs once a dry, small cough that is swallowed back into sleep almost before it is finished. The cough does not disturb anyone because everyone in this room knows the sound of a cough, that means illness, and the sound of a cough, that means only a dry throat, and this cough was the second kind. You listen to the silence after the cough, and the silence is so complete that you can hear the scratch of a mouse somewhere in the wall behind your head. A tiny, persistent sound that has been there for weeks and will be there for weeks more, because the cat is old and fat and no longer interested in anything that requires effort. The mouse scratches and stops and scratches again, and you follow the sound the way you follow the cracks in the ceiling, the way you follow the breathing of Mary, the way you follow everything that does not demand your attention, but accepts it quietly. Your feet are cold now. They have been cold all night, but you are only now noticing them because the rest of your body has woken up enough to send signals to your mind, and the first signal is always the cold in your feet. You curl your toes inside the wool of your stockings, and the wool is damp from the night air, and the damp makes the cold worse, but the movement makes the cold slightly less noticeable for a moment. You do this again, and the repetition is soothing in the way that all repetition is soothing in this house. You will do this many more times before the bell rings. You will curl and uncurl your toes, and you will watch the light move down the wall, and you will listen to the mouse, and you will count the breaths of the children around you, and all of this will happen without any decision on your part, because you are not a person who makes decisions, you are a person who makes decisions, you are a person who waits and watches and exists in the slow current of the days. The light is strong enough now to show the color of the blanket. It is grey as you knew it was grey, but now you can see that it is not one grey, but many greys woven together in a loose, rough twill. There is the grey of the undied wool, which is a brownish grey like a winter sky before snow. There is the grey of the dirt that has worked into the fibers over years of use, which is a darker grey, almost black in the deep folds. There is the grey of the worn spots where elbows and knees and chins have rubbed the wool thin, and the threads have separated, and the light comes through in a paler grey that is nearly white. You look at all these greys and you think about how many children have slept under this same blanket, and how many more will sleep under it after you are gone, and the thought is not sad, because nothing in this room is sad or happy. It only is. The bell will ring soon. You do not know how soon because you have no way of measuring the time between the full light and the bell, but you know from the angle of the light on the floorboards that it is nearly time. The light now reaches the third row of pallets, and the third row is where the older girls sleep, the ones who can already spin and sew, and who will leave next year or the year after to go into service in the big houses. They are still sleeping or pretending to sleep, and their faces are relaxed and empty in the grey light. You look at their faces and you see the same features repeated in different arrangements. The same thin cheeks and pale brows and slightly open mouths that you see on your own face when you catch your reflection in the dark glass of the window. You are all variations on a single design, and the design is not beautiful or ugly. It is only functional. It is only the shape that children take when they are fed enough to live and worked enough to be tired and left alone enough to become quiet. The ceiling is fully visible now, and the chicken-foot riverbed map is clear and sharp, and you trace its path again from the corner to the center to the two smaller branches. You notice a new crack that you have not seen before, a hairline fissure that runs from the window frame toward the Britain stain. You will watch this new crack in the mornings to come, and you will see if it grows, and you will add it to the map you keep in your mind, the map of the ceiling that is the only geography you know completely. The new crack is thin and hesitant, as if it is not sure it wants to become a crack at all, and you understand this hesitation in a way you cannot put into words. Your shoulder where it touches Mary is warm now, properly warm in a way that has spread beyond the point of contact into the surrounding flesh. The warmth has its own boundaries and its own geography, and you could map it if you wanted to the way you map the ceiling cracks. The center of the warmth is the point where your shoulder blade presses against her upper arm, and from that center the warmth radiates outward in diminishing circles until it meets the cold air at the edge of the blanket and stops. The boundary between warm and cold is sharp, and you can feel it as clearly as you can feel the hem of your shift against your neck. You will lie on this boundary for the remaining minutes until the bell, because moving would mean leaving the warmth, and there is no reason to leave the warmth before you must. The light has reached the floor now fully, and the floorboards show their true colors, which are brown and brown and brown, with variations so subtle that only someone who has looked at them for hundreds of hours could name them. The board with the eye knot is amber brown, where the resin has hardened into a glassy surface. The board with the long crack is grey brown, where dust has settled into the split. The board with the dark stain is black brown, where the liquid, whatever it was, soaked deep into the grain and dried there permanently. You look at these colors and you let your eyes go soft, so that the individual boards merge into a single surface, and then you focus again, so that the boards separate, and you do this several times, because it is something to do, and doing something, even something this small, makes the waiting feel more active, even though it is not. The mouse has stopped scratching. The silence without the mouse is different from the silence with the mouse, and you notice the difference, the way you notice all small differences in this room. The children's breathing fills the silence now, and you can pick out individual breaths if you try. The youngest child on the end breathes fast and light like a small bird. The older boy near the door breathes slow and heavy with a slight rasp that he has had all winter. Mary breathes in her 3-4 pattern, and you breathe in your own pattern, which you cannot hear because your own breathing is too close to your ears to be audible over the sound of your blood moving through your head. The combined sound of all these breaths is the sound of the house itself, a sound that never stops and never changes, and is never noticed except in moments like this, when everything else is still. The bell does not ring yet. You're still waiting, and the waiting is still soft and formless, and the light is still growing stronger, and the cold is still pressing down, and the warmth is still holding, and all of these things are happening at once, and none of them require anything from you. You are a point of stillness in a room of stillness, and the day will begin when the bell decides it will begin, and not before. You close your eyes. The light comes through your eyelids as a red-orange glow, and you watch the glow pulse slightly with your heartbeat, which is slow and steady and unconcerned. You could sleep again. You could let the red-orange fade back to black, and return to the place where the ceiling cracks, and the Britain stain, and the chicken-foot riverbed do not exist. But you do not sleep. You stay in the space between where the bell is not yet ringing and the day is not yet here, and the only thing required of you is to breathe, and to be still, and to wait in the texture of the dormitory light, the weight of the porridge spoon. The bell rings, and it is not loud, but it is insistent, and it is the same sound it has been every morning since before you arrived, and it will be the same sound every morning after you leave. The bell is brass, and it hangs in the passage outside the overseer's door, and it is rung by the oldest girl, who is called Sarah, though her name was something else before she came here, and you do not know what that name was. The sound of the bell travels down the passage and into the dormitory, and it settles over the children like a second blanket, a blanket made of sound rather than wool, and it pulls them upward out of the grey light and into the beginning of the day. You sit up. Your body knows how to sit up without you telling it to, because it has done this same motion in this same room, at this same sound for so many mornings, that the motion is part of you, the way breathing is part of you. The blanket falls away from your shoulders, and the cold air that has been waiting at the boundary of the warmth rushes in and takes the warmth's place, and you feel the cold in your neck and your arms and the parts of your back that were pressed against Mary's shoulder. Mary is also sitting up, and her hair is tangled in the back where she slept on it, and you see this without really seeing it, because you are not looking at Mary. You are looking at the floor where your feet will go when you stand. Standing is a sequence. You push the blanket aside with one hand, while the other hand presses against the straw pallet to lift your weight. Your knees are stiff from the cold and from the stillness, and they protest with a small ache that is familiar and unremarkable. You rise, and your feet find the cold boards, and the cold travels up through your soles and into your ankles, and you curl your toes against it without thinking. Around you the other children are rising in the same way at the same time, and the room is filled with the soft sounds of straw rustling and wool shifting, and the occasional small cough that comes from a dry throat waking into the colder air of the passage. The passage is darker than the dormitory because there is no window, and the only light comes from the door at the far end that leads to the kitchen yard. You walk with the others in a line that forms without instruction, because instruction is not needed for things that happen every day. Your feet know where the boards creak and where the nails have risen slightly above the surface, and you avoid these places without thinking, the way water avoids a stone. The passage walls are plaster, and they are the color of old meal, a pale brownish grey that soaks up the dim light and gives nothing back. You have looked at these walls for so many hours that you can see them with your eyes closed, which you sometimes do when the line moves slowly and there is nothing else to occupy your attention. The refectory is a long, low room with a ceiling supported by 3 beams that are dark with age and smoke. The beams are oak, and they were cut from trees that grew somewhere in this parish long before anyone in this house was born, and they still hold the shape of the trees inside them if you know how to look. You do know how to look because you have spent many meals staring up at the beams while your spoon moved through the porridge and your mind moved through nothing in particular. The grain of the wood runs in long wavy lines that curve around the knots where branches once grew, and the smoke from the kitchen fire has darkened the raised parts of the grain while leaving the lower parts a slightly lighter brown. The effect is a kind of map, and you've traced this map many times, though you could not say what country it represents. The tables are 2 long boards set on trestles that run the length of the room. The boards are pine, and they are lighter than the beams, and they are scarred with the marks of many spoons and many bowls and many years of children eating without speaking. The benches are also pine, and they are worn smooth in the center, where generations of children have sat, and the wear is a shallow depression that fits the shape of a sitting body so precisely that you do not need to find your place, because the place finds you. You sit in your place, which is the same place you sat yesterday, and will sit tomorrow, and the wood receives you with the indifference of something that has received so many bodies that one more is nothing. The bowl is in front of you. It is wooden, and it is brown, and it is the same bowl you have used since you came to this house, and it will be someone else's bowl when you leave. The wood is beech, and it has darkened where your hands have held it over the months and years, and the darkened areas form a pattern that is unique to your grip. You could identify your bowl among all the other bowls by this pattern alone, the way a shepherd identifies a sheep by the shape of its face. The bowl is empty now, and it waits with the patience of objects that have no need to hurry. The porridge arrives in a large iron pot carried by 2 of the older girls who walk slowly and carefully from the kitchen door. The pot is black on the outside from the fire, and it is grey on the inside from years of oats and water and salt. Steam rises from the surface of the porridge, and the steam is white and thick and it carries the smell of cooked grain into the cold air of the refectory. The smell is the same smell it always is, and it fills your nose and your mouth and your stomach, which makes a small sound of recognition that you ignore because ignoring bodily sounds is one of the first things you learned in this house. The serving begins at the head of the table, where the oldest children sit, and it moves down the row toward the youngest at the foot. You are somewhere in the middle, and you watch the ladle rise and fall with the same steady rhythm that it always has. The ladle is iron, and it has a long handle, and the girl who holds it with both hands because the pot is heavy, and the porridge is heavy, and the repetition of the motion requires a certain kind of attention that you understand without being able to name. The porridge falls from the ladle into each bowl with a soft, wet sound that is the same for every bowl, and yet somehow different because the distance varies slightly, and the angle varies slightly, and the amount varies slightly, though the girl tries to make it the same. You have noticed these small variations over many mornings, and you have come to appreciate them as the only kind of variety this room offers. Your bowl is filled. The porridge settles into the curve of the wood, and the surface steams upward, and you watch the steam curl and twist in the cold air until it dissolves into nothing. The surface of the porridge is greyish-beige, and it has a slight sheen from the water that has not yet been absorbed, and the sheen reflects the light from the high window in a pale rectangle that wavers when you breathe. You do not eat yet. No one eats yet, because the overseer has not yet spoken the brief words that are spoken before every meal. Words that you have heard so many times that they have lost all meaning and become simply another sound like the bell or the creak of the floorboards. The overseer stands at the head of the room near the door to the passage. He is a man of middle height and middle age, and his face is the face of someone who has overseen many children and will oversee many more, and the children are all the same to him, as the porridge is all the same to the ladle. He speaks, and his voice is low and even, and it fills the room without effort, because the room is built for low, even voices, and the children are trained to hear low, even voices. The words pass over you like the steam from the porridge, and you let them pass because there is nothing in them that requires your attention. When he finishes, there is a brief silence, and then the sound of 60 spoons being lifted from 60 tables begins. Your spoon is in your hand. It is pewter, and it is heavy for its size, or perhaps it only feels heavy because you are still waking up, and your arms are still slow from the night. The handle is smooth from use, and the bowl of the spoon is dented in one place where someone before you dropped it on the stone floor of the kitchen, and you run your thumb over this dent every morning without deciding to. The dent is shallow and oval, and it catches the light differently than the rest of the spoon, and you have come to think of it as the spoon's face, a face that looks up at you while you eat and asks nothing and expects nothing. The first spoonful of porridge is the same as all the spoonfuls that will follow, but you notice it more because it is the first, and because your mouth is empty, and the contrast between empty and full is the only contrast this meal offers. The porridge is warm but not hot, because the journey from the kitchen to the table has stolen some of its heat, and the wooden bowl has stolen more. It is thick enough to hold its shape on the spoon, but not so thick that it resists being swallowed. It tastes of oats and water and a faint saltiness that is barely there, and you have eaten this exact taste so many times that you no longer think of it as taste but as texture, a texture that fills your mouth and warms your throat and settles in your stomach with the weight of something that is both food and routine. The second spoonful follows the first after a pause that is determined by the rhythm of your chewing and swallowing and breathing. The rhythm is slow because there is no reason to hurry, and hurrying would only draw attention to yourself, and attention is never wanted in this room. You lift the spoon from the bowl to your mouth, and the spoon travels the same path it always travels, and your head tips forward slightly to meet it, and your lips close around the pewter, and the porridge slides off into your mouth, and the spoon returns to the bowl. This sequence repeats, and you count it sometimes, not with numbers, but with the awareness that you are doing the same thing again, and that the repetition is the point of the thing. The refectory is quiet, except for the sound of eating. 60 children eating porridge with wooden spoons from wooden bowls makes a sound that is soft and rhythmic and layered. There is the scrape of pewter against wood, and the wet sound of porridge being moved around, and the occasional click of a spoon set down for a moment, and the even more occasional cough or sniffle that is quickly suppressed. The sound is like rain on a roof. if the rain were very slow and very steady and made of oats instead of water. You listen to this sound because there is nothing else to listen to, and because listening is something your ears do without your permission. You hear the difference between the older children who eat with the efficiency of long practice, and the younger children who eat with the clumsiness of short arms and new teeth. You hear the child next to you who is a boy named Thomas, or perhaps John, and he breathes through his mouth when he eats, which makes a small whistling sound that you have learned to ignore. You hear the overseer at the head of the room turning a page in his book, and the page is paper, and it makes a dry rustling sound that cuts through the wet sounds of the eating like a stone through water. Your spoon reaches the bottom of the bowl, and the sound changes. The pewter scrapes against wood without the cushion of porridge, and the scrape is higher and sharper, and you do it only once before you stop, because scraping the bowl is discouraged. There is still a thin film of porridge on the wood, and you could collect it with your finger, but fingers are not used for eating in this house, and so you leave the film where it is, and you set your spoon down on the table beside the bowl. The spoon rests with the bowl facing up, and the dent catches the light, and you look at it for a moment, before you look away. The meal is not over, because the meal is over when the overseer stands, and not before. You sit with your empty bowl and your still spoon, and you wait. Waiting after eating is different from waiting before eating, because your stomach is full, and the fullness makes you slightly heavier, slightly slower, slightly more inclined to let your eyes rest on the surface of the table without focusing. The table surface is pine, and it has the same scars and stains it had yesterday, and you trace them with your eyes the way you traced the ceiling cracks in the dormitory. There is a ring where a bowl of something wet sat too long, and the moisture raised the grain into a circle that is still visible years later. There is a gouge where someone carved a letter with a spoon handle, and the letter is an A, or perhaps an H, and you have wondered about that letter many times without ever wondering enough to ask. There is a dark spot near the edge where a child before you spilled something, and the something soaked in and became part of the wood forever. The overseer stands, and the sound of his chair pushing back is the signal. You stand with the others, and you take your bowl and your spoon, and you join the line that leads to the kitchen door. The kitchen is warm and steamy, and it smells of the next meal, which is already beginning to simmer in the large pot over the fire. You hand your bowl to the girl who washes the bowls, and she takes it without looking at you, and you place your spoon in the bucket of spoons, and the spoon clinks against the other spoons, and the sound is metallic and brief. Then you walk back through the passage to the dormitory to fold your blanket and to begin the next part of the day, which will be the same as this part, and the part before it, and the part after it. The weight of the porridge spoon stays with you for a while after you set it down. Not the physical weight, because the spoon is no longer in your hand, but the memory of the weight, the way your fingers curved around the handle, and the way your wrist bent to lift it, and the way the pewter felt against your palm. You will hold this spoon again at the midday meal, and again at the evening meal, and again tomorrow morning, and the weight will be the same every time, and your hand will remember it every time, and the repetition will be a comfort of sorts. A thing that does not change in a life where most things do not change, and the ones that do change so slowly that you cannot see the change happening. You walk back to the dormitory, and your feet are cold again because the passage floor is cold and your stockings are thin. The cold is the same cold as this morning, and it will be the same cold tomorrow morning, and you accept it, the way you accept the weight of the spoon, and the taste of the porridge, and the sound of 60 children eating in silence. The day is only beginning, and already it has contained everything it will contain, and you are content with this because contentment is the only thing you have learned to feel, and you feel it the way the bowl feels the porridge, and the spoon feels the hand feels the cold that will never quite go away. The sorting of the undied wool. The afternoon arrives without announcement, because afternoons in this house do not arrive so much as they simply replace the morning while you are looking at something else. You have spent the hours since the porridge in the familiar sequence of tasks that fill the space between meals, and the tasks have been so unremarkable that you could not describe them now if someone asked, though no one ever asks. There was the folding of blankets and the sweeping of the dormitory floor with a broom made of twigs bound together with twine, and the carrying of the night soil bucket to the pit behind the kitchen garden, and the standing in line for a drink of water from the dipper that hangs by the pump. All of these things happened and you did them, and now they are over, and the afternoon is here, and the afternoon means wool. The wool room is at the back of the house, past the kitchen, and down 2 stone steps that are worn into shallow bowls by generations of feet. The room has a single window that faces north, and the light that comes through it is grey and even, and it casts no shadows because shadows would make the work harder, and the work is already hard enough in ways that have nothing to do with light. The floor is stone, and it is cold even in summer and in winter, which this is cold enough that you feel it through the soles of your stockings and into the bones of your feet. You have learned not to notice this cold, or rather you have learned to notice it without letting it disturb you the way you notice your own breathing, without letting it interrupt your thoughts. The wool arrives in large sacks made of coarse linen that are brought in from the storage shed by 2 of the older boys. The sacks are heavy, and they slump against the stone floor with a soft thump that sends up a small cloud of dust and lanolin and the smell of sheep that has been trapped inside the tight weave of the fabric. The smell fills the room, and it is a smell that you know as well as you know the smell of porridge, or the smell of the lye soap, or the smell of your own blanket in the dark of the dormitory. It is a thick smell, a greasy smell, a smell that clings to your hands and your clothes and your hair, and you will carry it with you for the rest of the day and into the night until you wash again, which will not be until Saturday. You sit on the floor with the others. The floor is where the children sit because chairs cost money, and because sitting on the floor keeps you close to the wool, which is also on the floor, and because the overseer believes that children who sit on chairs grow soft, and children who sit on stain grow strong, though you have never felt particularly strong after an afternoon on the stone. You arrange your legs in the way that you have found causes the least discomfort over the long hours, a way that involves crossing them at the ankle and tucking them slightly to the side, so that your weight rests on one hip while the other hip takes its turn at resting. The position will change many times before the work is done, and each change will bring a temporary relief that fades back into the same dull ache that lives in the background of all your days. The wool is in front of you in a heap that reaches nearly to your knees when you are sitting. It is undyed, and it is the color of winter fields and dirty snow and the underbelly of clouds before rain. The color is not one grey, but many greys layered together in a tangle that your hands will spend the afternoon untangling. Some of the wool is pale, almost white, where it grew close to the skin of the sheep, and some is dark, almost black, where the tips were exposed to the weather and the dirt and the sun of a summer you did not see. Most of it is a middle grey that has brown in it and yellow in it and a faint green from the grass that the sheep ate before it was shorn. You look at all these greys, and you think about how many greys there are in the world and how you have seen more greys than any other colour, and how this is probably true for everyone in this house. The work begins without a signal, because everyone knows when to begin and beginning. Late would mean finishing late, and finishing late would mean missing the evening meal, and missing the evening meal is not something anyone wants. You reach into the heap, and your fingers close around a handful of wool that is warm from the pile, and greasy with lanolin, and full of the small bits of things that collect in the fleece of an animal that lives outdoors. There are pieces of straw and dried grass and small hard seeds that catch on the wool fibers and refuse to let go. There are bits of thistle and burdock and the tiny round droppings of the sheep themselves, which are dry and hard and fall out easily when you shake the wool, but which you must touch with your fingers anyway because that is the work. Your task is to separate the wool into 2 piles. The first pile is the good wool, the long fibers that can be spun into thread and then woven into cloth and then made into the clothes that you and the other children wear. The second pile is the waste, the short fibers and the tangled mats and the wool that is too full of vegetable matter to be worth cleaning. You make this decision over and over for each handful of wool, and the decision is usually the same, because most of the wool is good enough, and only the very worst must be discarded. You pull the fibers apart with your fingers, and you feel the resistance of the wool as it clings to itself, and you overcome this resistance with a slow, steady pressure that you have learned through many afternoons of this same work. The lanolin coats your hands within the first few minutes. It is a thick yellowish grease that the sheep produces to keep its fleece waterproof, and it works so well that the sheep can stand in the rain all day and still be dry beneath the outer layer. You have never seen a sheep standing in the rain, but you have been told about it by the same older boy who told you about the sea and the chicken foot crack, And you believe him because the lanolin on your hands is proof that the sheep have a secret for staying dry. The grease makes your fingers slippery at first, and the wool slides through them in a way that is almost pleasant. But as the afternoon wears on, the lanolin mixes with the dirt from the wool and the dirt from your own hands, and it becomes a greyish paste that works its way under your nails and into the creases of your knuckles. You will scrub this paste away on Saturday with cold water and lye soap, and the scrubbing will make your hands raw and red. And then on Monday you will begin again. The repetition of the work is the work. You pull a handful of wool from the heap, and you hold it up to the grey light from the north window. And you look for the tangles and the mats and the places where the fibres have felted together into a solid mass that cannot be pulled apart without breaking the fibres themselves. You find these places with your eyes, and then with your fingers, and you work at them, slowly pulling a few fibres free at a time, until the mass loosens and becomes usable again. Sometimes the mass will not loosen, and you must put it in the waste pile, and you feel a small regret each time because the wool came from a sheep that grew it over a whole year, and now it will be thrown away, or used for stuffing pallets, or burned in the kitchen fire. The regret is small, and it passes quickly, because there is more wool and more handfuls, and the work continues regardless of what you feel. The sound of the wool room is a soft sound. 16 children sitting on a stone floor sorting wool make almost no noise at all, because the wool absorbs sound the way it absorbs water and grease and the grey light from the window. There is the occasional rustle of a handful being turned over, and the occasional small cough, and the occasional shift of a body trying to find a more comfortable position on the unyielding stone. There is also the sound of the older girl in the corner who works the wool combs, and the combs make a rhythmic scratching sound as the wire teeth pull through the fibres, aligning them into long straight rows that will become the roving for the spinning wheel. The scratching sound is steady and hypnotic, and you listen to it without listening the way you listen to your own heartbeat when everything else is quiet. The window shows you nothing but grey sky. The glass is the same thick wavy glass as the dormitory window, and it has the same bubbles trapped inside, and the same faint greenish tint that comes from the iron in the sand that was used to make it. You look up at the window from time to time when your neck grows stiff from looking down at the wool, and you see only the grey and the bubbles and the faint distortion of the bare branches of the tree that grows in the kitchen yard. The branches are black against the grey, and they do not move because there is no wind today, or if there is wind it is blowing from a direction that does not reach this side of the house. You watch the branches for a moment, and then you return to the wall, because the wall is what you were here for. The piles grow slowly. The good pile on your right side becomes a small hill of pale grey fibres that have been pulled straight and laid flat in layers that will make them easy to gather later. The waste pile on your left side becomes a smaller hill of dark tangles and vegetable matter, and the short bits of wool that are too short to spin. You are careful to keep the piles separate because mixing them would undo the work, and the work is all there is. The good pile is soft and springy, and it smells clean in a way that the unsorted wool does not, because you have removed the dirt and the seeds and the other things that made it smell like a sheep instead of like wool. You press your palm down on the good pile occasionally to feel the spring of it, and the spring is satisfying in a way that you cannot explain. Your back begins to ache after the first hour. The ache starts in the place between your shoulder blades where you hold the tension of leaning forward, and it spreads upward into your neck and downward into the small of your back where the stone floor presses against you. You change your position and the ache moves to a different place, but it does not go away because the ache is part of the work, the way the lanolin is part of the wool. You have learned to let the ache be there without fighting it and without giving it your full attention, and this is a skill that took many afternoons to acquire, and you are still acquiring it, and you will probably always be acquiring it. The ache is just another texture of the afternoon, another grey in the collection of greys that make up your day. The seeds are the worst part. They are small and hard, and they have tiny hooks or barbs that catch on the wool fibres and hold on with a grip that seems impossible for something so small. You must pick them out one by one with your fingernails, and sometimes the seed comes free easily, and sometimes it brings a tuft of good wool with it, and you must decide whether the tuft is worth saving or whether it should go into the waste pile with the seed still attached. You make this decision dozens of times in an afternoon, and each decision is small and insignificant, and together they add up to the shape of your day. The seeds are mostly from plants you have never seen growing, but you know their names because the older girls have taught you. There is burdock and thistle and cleavers, and the tiny black seeds of the plant they call corncockle, which is poisonous to eat, but harmless in wool. You say these names to yourself sometimes as you pick out the seeds, and the names become a kind of rhythm, a kind of song that has no melody but still fills the space behind your eyes. The shaft of sunlight that you have been waiting for arrives without announcement. It comes through the high window in the dormitory every afternoon, but here in the wool room, the window faces north, and so the sun never comes directly through the glass. Instead, the light changes by small degrees, and you notice that the grey on the wall opposite the window has become a warmer grey, a grey with yellow hiding inside it. This is the closest thing to sunlight that this room receives, and you watch it move across the wall with a slowness that is almost stillness. The light touches the edge of a wooden shelf where the finished roving is stored, and it makes the wool on the shelf glow faintly, as if the wool itself is producing the light rather than reflecting it. You watch this glow for a moment, and then you return to your hands because the work does not stop for light. Your fingers know the wool now. They have been working for long enough that the initial resistance of the unfamiliar handfuls has given way to a kind of familiarity, a kind of knowing that lives in the tips of your fingers and does not require your mind to participate. You can feel the difference between a tangle that will yield to gentle pressure and a tangle that will not, and you make the distinction without thinking about it. You can feel the difference between a fiber that is long enough to spin and a fiber that is too short, and you separate them without looking. Your hands have become skilled at this one thing, and the skill is useless outside of this room, but inside this room it is the only skill that matters. The afternoon deepens. The grey light from the north window becomes a darker grey, and the shadows that were not there before begin to gather in the corners of the room where the stone walls meet the stone floor. You cannot see the sun setting because the window faces the wrong direction, but you can feel the day tilting toward evening, the way you can feel the weight of the porridge spoon in your hand, even after you have set it down. The work continues because there is still wool in the sack, and there will be wool in the sack until the bell rings for the evening meal, and even then there will still be wool in the sack for tomorrow and the day after and the day after that. You think about the sheep while you work. You have seen sheep only a few times when the flock was brought down from the hills for shearing, and you stood at the kitchen yard wall and watched the great mass of grey-white bodies moving like a single creature across the green field. The sheep were loud and they smelled stronger than the wool smells, and they pushed against each other with a kind of blind urgency that seemed to have no purpose. You wondered then what it would be like to be a sheep, and to grow this wool that you now hold in your hands, and to have it taken from you once a year and then to grow it again. The wondering did not lead anywhere, because wondering never leads anywhere in this house, but it filled the space behind your eyes for a while, and that was enough. The older girl at the wool combs stops her work, and you notice the silence where the scratching sound used to be. She stretches her arms above her head, and you see the muscles in her shoulders move under her dress, and then she returns to the combs, and the scratching begins again. The interruption was brief, and it changed nothing, but you noticed it, because noticing small changes is what your mind does when there is nothing larger to notice. You return to your own work and your own small changes, and the afternoon continues. The piles are substantial now. The good pile reaches halfway up your shin, and it is a soft, pale mountain of potential thread and cloth and clothing. The waste pile is smaller but denser, and it will be gathered up at the end of the session and taken away to be used for something else, because nothing in this house is truly wasted. You look at your piles and you feel something that is not pride, because pride is not encouraged, but is perhaps satisfaction, or perhaps simply the awareness that you have done what you were supposed to do. The feeling is small and quiet, and it passes into the general grey of the afternoon, the way the steam from the porridge passed into the air of the refectory. Your hands are grey now. The lanolin and the dirt have worked into every crease and every line, and the skin of your palms is a map of the afternoon's labour. You rub your hands together, and the friction warms them slightly, but it does not clean them, and you do not expect it to. You will carry this grey with you to the evening meal, and you will eat your bread and your broth with grey hands, and no one will notice, because everyone's hands are grey. The grey is a uniform the way the wool is a uniform, the way the days are a uniform, the way everything in this house is a variation on a single theme that never changes and never ends. The bell will ring soon. You know this, the way you knew it in the dormitory this morning, the way you always know when the next thing is about to happen. The light has reached a particular shade of grey that means evening, and your stomach has begun to make the small sounds that mean hunger, and the other children have begun to shift on the stone floor with a restlessness that means they too feel the day tilting toward its end. You pull one more handful of wool from the dwindling heap, and you separate the good from the waste, and you add them to their respective piles. Then you sit with your grey hands resting on your grey dress, and you wait for the bell that will release you from this room and deliver you to the next room and the next task and the next texture of the long, slow afternoon that is now nearly over. The geometry of the garden wall, the bell that releases you from the wool room is the same bell that called you to the porridge, and it makes the same sound, and you feel the same small shift in your body, from stillness to motion. You stand and the stone floor has left its cold imprint on your legs, and the imprint will fade slowly as you walk, but it will not fade completely until you have been sitting again for some time. The other children are standing too, and together you move toward the door and up the 2 worn stone steps and into the passage that leads past the kitchen, where the smell of the evening broth is already beginning to fill the air with the promise of warmth and salt and something that might be onion. But you do not go to the refectory yet. The afternoon is not quite finished, and there is a space between the wall room and the evening meal that belongs to the kitchen yard. This space is a gift of sorts, a pause in the long sequence of indoor tasks, and you are allowed to stand in the yard for a period of time that is never measured but is always the same. The yard is where the kitchen garden grows in summer, and where the rain barrel stands, and where the ashes from the fire are dumped in a grey mound that steams faintly when the weather is wet. In winter the yard is a place of cold air and bare earth, and the particular stillness that comes when nothing is growing and nothing is moving except the occasional bird that passes overhead without stopping. You step through the kitchen door and the air changes. Inside the air is warm and heavy and full of the smells of cooking and wool and the bodies of many children living close together. Outside the air is cold and sharp, and it fills your lungs with a cleanness that you have no words for. You breathe in deeply without meaning to, and the cold makes your nose ache slightly and your eyes water just at the corners, and you blink the water away and look around at the yard, which is exactly the same as it was yesterday and the day before. The kitchen yard is not large. It is bounded on 3 sides by the walls of the house, and the 4th side is the garden wall that separates the orphanage from the lane that runs past the parish church and down into the village. The wall is what you look at when you are in the yard, because there is nothing else to look at. The house walls are plain stone, and they have no windows at this level, and the ground is packed earth with patches of frozen mud, and a few scattered straws that have blown in from the stable. The rain barrel stands in the corner, and it is full of dark water that has a thin skin of ice around the edges, and the water reflects the grey sky in a way that makes it look deeper than it is. But you do not look at the rain barrel for long, because the wall draws your eyes the way the ceiling cracks. Draw your eyes in the dormitory, the way anything that is always there, but never quite the same, draws the attention of a mind that has learned to find variety in stillness. The garden wall is made of stone, and it is old. You do not know how old, because no one has ever told you, and you have never asked. But you can see the age in the way the stones have settled against each other over so many years that the mortar between them has crumbled in places and been replaced and crumbled again. The wall is perhaps 7 feet high, and it is thick enough that a person could walk along the top if the top were flat. But the top is not flat, because the stones are uneven, and some are higher than others, and the whole length of the wall rises and falls in a gentle wave that follows the contour of the ground beneath it. You have traced this wave with your eyes many times, and you know its shape the way you know the shape of the porridge spoon in your hand. The stones themselves are of 2 kinds. There is flint, which is dark and glossy and breaks with a sharp edge that looks almost like glass, and there is limestone, which is paler and softer and has tiny holes in its surface where water has dissolved the stone over centuries. The flint stones are mostly grey and black, and they have a smooth skin on the outside that the masons called the cortex. And beneath the cortex the stone is a darker grey that gleams when the light hits it at a certain angle. The limestone stones are the colour of old bone or dirty chalk, and they are rough to the touch in a way that the flint is not. You know the roughness of the limestone because you have touched the wall many times, though you are not supposed to touch it, and touching it leaves a white dust on your fingers that you must wipe on your dress before you go back inside. The mortar that holds the stones together is a pale greyish brown, and it has been patched in so many places that the wall looks like a garment that has been mended by many hands over many years. The original mortar is crumbling and sandy, and you can pick it out with your fingernail if you are careful, though you rarely do this because picking at the wall is one of the things that will earn you a sharp word from the overseer. The newer mortar is harder and smoother, and it has a slightly different colour, a yellower grey that marked the places where the wall was repaired after the great storm that happened before you came to this house. You know about the storm because the older children have told you, and because there is still a slight lean to the wall near the gate where the wind pushed against it, and the stones shifted before the mortar could set. The gate is at the end of the wall nearest the lane, and it is made of wood that is weathered to the same grey as the stones. The gate is always closed, and it is held shut by a heavy iron latch that you have never seen opened, though you know it must open because the carter comes through it when he delivers the flour and the salt and the other things that arrive from the village. You have never seen the carter come through the gate because you are always somewhere else when he arrives, and by the time you come to the yard, the gate is closed again, and the latch is dropped into its iron loop, and everything is as it was before. The gate is just another part of the wall, a part that happens to be made of wood instead of stone, but that serves the same purpose of keeping the inside separate from the outside. The moss is what you notice first today. It grows in the crevices between the stones, where the mortar has crumbled away and the rainwater has collected, and the shade has lingered long enough for the small green plants to take hold. The moss is a deep green that is almost black in the deepest shadows, and a brighter green where the light from the grey sky touches it directly. There are several different kinds of moss growing on the wall, though you do not know their names. Some of it is low and flat, and it clings to the stone like a thin carpet of velvet that you want to touch but rarely do, because touching the moss damages it, and then it takes a long time to grow back. Some of it stands up in tiny stems with even tinier leaves that look like the branches of a tree seen from very far away. Some of it is a pale silvery green that grows only on the north-facing side of the wall where the sun never reaches and where the dampness lingers longest. You stand with your back against the kitchen wall, and you look at the moss, and you let your eyes go soft so that the individual patches merge into a single pattern of green and grey. Then you focus again and the pattern separates into its component parts, and you can see the places where one kind of moss meets another kind and they grow together without fighting the way the children sleep together in the dormitory, without fighting. The boundary between the mosses is a soft boundary, a blending rather than a line, and you think about how the moss has found a place to live on this wall, and how it will stay there for as long as the wall stands, and how no one will ever notice it except you and perhaps the other children who stand in this yard and look at the wall, because there is nothing else to look at the wall, because there is nothing else to look at. The ivy grows on the section of the wall nearest the rain barrel. It is English ivy with dark green leaves that have 3 or 5 points and veins that are paler than the rest of the leaf. The ivy climbs the wall by sending out small rootlets that grip the stone and the mortar and hold on with a strength that seems impossible for something so small. You've watched the ivy grow over the seasons, and you have noticed that it grows faster in the spring and slower in the winter, but that it never stops growing entirely. The leaves are all angled toward the light, and when a breeze moves through the yard, which happens only occasionally, the leaves turn very slightly on their stems and then return to their original position when the breeze passes. You watch this movement now because there is a small breeze moving through the yard, and the ivy leaves are turning and returning, and the motion is hypnotic in its slowness. The breeze is cold, and it finds the gaps in your woolen dress and the gaps in your stockings, and it reminds you that you are standing still in a cold yard, and that standing still in a cold yard will eventually make you cold all the way through. But the cold is not yet uncomfortable enough to make you want to go back inside, and so you stay where you are, and you continue to look at the wall, and the ivy, and the moss, and the stones, and the mortar, and the gate that leads to a lane you have never walked down. The flintstones catch your attention next. There is one stone in particular that you always look at when you are in the yard, because it is different from the others. It is a large flint nodule that has been split open, and the inside is exposed to the air, and the inside is a dark glossy grey that gleams even in the flat light of a winter afternoon. The surface of the split is curved and smooth, and it looks like the inside of a shell or the surface of a frozen puddle, and you sometimes imagine that you can see your reflection in it, though you cannot, because the stone is too high and you are too short, and the angle is wrong. The stone is set into the wall about 4 feet from the ground, and it is surrounded by smaller stones that seem to cluster around it, the way the younger children cluster around the older ones when they are cold or frightened, or simply in need of something they cannot name. You count the stones sometimes. Not all of them, because the wall is long and your time in the yard is short, but a section of the wall that you have chosen for no particular reason. Today you count the stones between the ivy and the gate, and you find that there are 47 stones visible in that section. Some of them are large, and some are small, and some are only partially visible because they are buried in the mortar or covered by the ivy. The number 47 means nothing, and you do not expect it to mean anything, but the act of counting fills the time and gives your eyes something to do and keeps your mind from wandering to places that are less comfortable than the cold kitchen yard. The mortar joints form a pattern that you have also studied. The masons who built this wall did not lay the stones in neat rows, because the stones are all different shapes and sizes, and fitting them together was a matter of finding the right stone for the right space, rather than following a plan. The result is a wall that looks random, but is not random because each stone is held in place by the stones around it, and the whole thing stands because of the careful choices made by men who are now dead and buried and forgotten. The mortar joints run between the stones like rivers on a map, and they branch and merge, and sometimes they form small pools where the mortar has filled a gap that was too large for any single stone. You trace these rivers with your eyes, and you follow them from the top of the wall to the bottom and then back up again along a different route. The base of the wall is different from the upper parts. Near the ground the stones are larger, and they are set deeper into the earth, and they are covered with a fine grey lichen that looks like paint spilled from a careless brush. The lichen is dry and crusty, and it flakes off if you touch it, and the flakes are pale grey on one side and dark grey on the other. You have touched the lichen once or twice and you remember the feel of it on your fingers. A dry, crumbling texture that is nothing like the softness of the moss or the smoothness of the flint. The lichen grows only near the ground, where the dampness rises from the soil and where the rain splashes up from the packed earth of the yard. It does not grow higher than about 2 feet, and you have wondered about this without ever finding an answer. A bird lands on the top of the wall. It is a sparrow, a small brown-grey bird with a short tail and a quick, nervous way of moving. The sparrow hops along the uneven top of the wall, and it stops every few inches to look around with its small black eyes that see things you cannot see. You watch the sparrow because there is nothing else moving in the yard except the ivy leaves when the breeze comes, and the breeze is not coming now. The sparrow hops and stops and hops again, and then it flies away toward the lane, and you lose sight of it behind the wall. You wonder where it goes and what it sees on the other side. But the wandering is brief, and it fades because the wall is still there, and the yard is still there, and you are still standing with your back against the kitchen wall looking at the stones. The light is changing. It is later than you thought, or perhaps time moves differently when you are standing still and looking at a wall. The grey of the sky has deepened to a darker grey, and the shadows in the crevices of the wall have grown longer and softer, and the moss has lost its brighter green and become a uniform dark colour that is almost black. You can feel the cold more clearly now, and it has moved from the surface of your skin into the muscles beneath, and you know that soon the bell will ring for the evening meal, and you will go back inside, and the wall will remain here in the yard, waiting for tomorrow. You think about the wall when you are not looking at it. You think about it in the dormitory at night, when you are lying under the grey blanket and waiting for sleep. You think about the stones, and the moss, and the ivy, and the flint nodule with its glossy split surface. You think about the way the wall separates the yard from the lane, and the lane from the village, and the village from the fields, and the fields from the hills, and the hills from the sky. The wall is a boundary, and you live on one side of it, and everything else lives on the other side. This is not a sad thought, because you have never known anything different, and the wall is not a prison wall. It is just a wall, a thing made of stone and mortar and moss that happens to stand between you and the lane. Your feet are cold now, and you shift your weight from one foot to the other. The packed earth of the yard is hard and uneven, and there is a small stone pressing into the sole of your left foot through the thin leather of your shoe. You could move and find a different place to stand, but you do not, because the discomfort is small and familiar, and moving would mean losing the particular view of the wall that you have been studying. The flint nodule is directly in front of you, and the ivy is to your left, and the gate is to your right, and this arrangement pleases you in a way that has no name. The wall has been here longer than you have been alive, and it will be here after you have gone. This is a thought that comes to you sometimes when you are standing in the yard, and it is not a sad thought or a happy thought. It is just a fact, like the fact that the porridge is grey, or that the wall smells of sheep. The wall does not know you are looking at it, and it would not care if it did know. The wall is doing what walls do, which is to stand and to separate and to provide a place for moss and ivy and lichen to grow. You are doing what children do, which is to stand and to look and to fill the time between tasks with the quiet observation of things that do not change or change so slowly that the change is invisible. The bell rings. It is the same bell that has rung for every meal and every transition since you came to this house, and it will ring for every meal and every transition until you leave. The sound reaches you in the yard, and it is muffled slightly by the walls of the house, but it is still clear enough to pull you out of your stillness and back into motion. You push yourself away from the kitchen wall, and your back is cold where the stone has stolen your warmth, and you rub the cold spot with one hand as you walk toward the door. The wall remains behind you, and you do not look back because you will see it again tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. The geometry of the garden wall is the same as it was yesterday. The stones are in the same places, and the moss is the same color, and the ivy leaves are angled toward the same grey sky. The only thing that has changed is the light, which has moved from one shade of grey to another, and the cold which has settled a little deeper into your bones, and the small indent in the packed earth where you were standing, which will be gone by morning. You walk through the kitchen door, and the warm air wraps around you, and the smell of broth fills your nose, and you leave the wall to its stillness, and its patience, and its long, slow existence on the boundary between the inside and the outside of your life. The mending of the hem's evening comes to the house in the way that all things come to this house, which is to say slowly and without announcement, and with the same grey light that has filled every hour since morning, now deepening into something that is almost darkness, but not quite. You have eaten the evening broth, and you have washed your bowl and your spoon, and you have stood in line for a drink of water, and you have used the night bucket behind the screen in the passage. These things have happened, and they are over. And now you are sitting in the long, low room that serves as the evening workroom, a room that is identical to the refectory in every way except that there is no table, only benches arranged in a circle, around the single candle that burns on a stand in the center. The candle is tallow, and it is made from the fat of sheep that were slaughtered for the tables of the village, and the fat has been rendered and poured into molds and fitted with a wick of twisted flax. The flame is yellow, and it moves constantly in small jerks and flickers that make the shadows on the walls move in response. The shadows are the shadows of 16 children sitting on benches, and the shadows stretch upward toward the ceiling beams, and they merge and separate and merge again as the candle flame wavers. You have watched these shadows on many evenings, and you have come to recognize the particular way that your own shadow leans slightly to the left because of the way you hold your head when you are sewing. The sewing is in your lap. It is a linen shift that belongs to one of the younger children. A girl named Alice, or perhaps Agnes, and the hem has come undone along a length of about 6 inches. The linen is unbleached, and it is the color of weak tea or old paper, and it has been washed so many times that the fibers are soft and thin, and almost transparent in the places where the wear is greatest. The undone hem shows the raw edge of the fabric where the threads have pulled away from the stitching, and the raw edge is slightly frayed, and you can see the individual threads of the warp and the weft crossing each other at right angles. You have looked at this frayed edge for several minutes now, because looking at the work is part of the work, and because there is no need to hurry when the evening stretches ahead of you in a long, slow line that ends only with sleep. The needle is in your right hand. It is steel, and it is thin, and it has been sharpened many times on the small whetstone that lives in the mending basket, and the point is fine enough to pass between the threads of the linen without catching or pulling. The needle has a small eye at the top, and through this eye passes a length of linen thread that is the same color as the shift, or nearly the same color, because the thread was spun from flax that grew in a different field and was retted in a different pond, and the color is a shade lighter than the fabric. You have noticed this difference and you have decided that it does not matter because the mending will be on the inside of the hem where no one will see it except perhaps the person who mends it again after you are gone. The thread is about 18 inches long and you have pulled it through the eye of the needle and doubled it back on itself and made a small knot at the end. The knot is a simple overhand knot that you have made thousands of times and your fingers know how to make it without your mind telling them what to do. The knot rests between your thumb and forefinger and you test it with a small tug to make sure it will hold, and then you turn your attention to the shift and the undone hem and the task that will fill the next hour of your life. You find the place where the original stitching still holds. This is the starting point, and you insert the needle into the fabric just beyond the last intact stitch, pushing it through from the inside of the hem so that the knot will be hidden between the layers of linen when the work is done. The needle passes through the fabric with a small resistance that you feel in your fingertips, and then it emerges on the other side, and you pull it through, slowly drawing the thread after it until the knot catches against the fabric and holds. This is the first stitch of many, and it is no different from the last stitch you made yesterday evening or the first stitch you will make tomorrow evening, but you notice it because beginnings are the only part of repetition that still hold a small distinction. The stitch you are making is a running stitch and it is the simplest stitch there is. You push the needle down through the fabric and then up again a short distance ahead, and you pull the thread through and the thread lies flat against the linen in a line of small dashes that will hold the hem in place when the work is finished. The distance between stitches is about the width of your smallest fingernail, and you maintain this distance without measuring because your hands have learned the spacing through years of evenings, just like this one. The rhythm of the stitching is a rhythm that lives in your body, and it matches the rhythm of your breathing and the rhythm of the candle flame and the rhythm of the shadows moving on the wall. Your left hand holds the fabric and keeps the hem folded under at the proper width. The proper width is about 1/4 inch, and you fold it by feel rather than by sight, because the candlelight is not bright enough to show you the exact edge, and because you have folded so many hems that your fingers know what 1/4 inch feels like. The fold is held between your thumb and forefinger, and you move it forward as you stitch so that the next section is always ready for the needle. This movement is small and precise, and it happens without your attention, the way your feet find the worn spots on the passage floor without your attention. The sound of the evening workroom is the sound of many small things happening at once. There is the soft whisper of thread being pulled through fabric, and the occasional click of a needle being set down on a wooden bench, and the creak of the benches as children shift their weight to ease the ache in their backs. There is also the sound of the candle, which makes no noise at all except when the wick needs trimming, and then it makes a small sputtering sound that is the only variation in the long quiet. The older girl who supervises the evening work sits on a chair near the door, and she is also sewing something that you cannot see from your place on the bench. Her needle moves with a speed that yours will never have because she has been sewing for more years than you have been alive, and her hands have become something more than hands, something like the machines that you have heard about but never seen. Your back begins to ache after the first dozen stitches. The ache is in the same place between your shoulder blades where it always lives during the afternoon wool sorting, and it has returned now because you are leaning forward to see the fabric in the dim light. You straighten slightly and the ache eases and you continue stitching, and after a few more stitches you lean forward again without noticing, and the ache returns. This cycle repeats throughout the evening, and you are aware of it in the way that you are aware of your own breathing, which is to say you are aware of it only when you choose to be, and most of the time you do not choose to be. The thread grows shorter as you stitch. You watch it diminish with each pull through the fabric, and you know that soon you will reach the end of this length, and you will need to make a new knot and start a new thread. The shortening of the thread is the only measure of progress in this work, because the hem itself seems to remain the same length, no matter how many stitches you make. The undone section is 6 inches long, and each stitch covers perhaps 1/8 of an inch, and so you will need many stitches to close the gap. You do not count the stitches because counting would require a kind of attention that you are not giving to this task, but your body knows approximately how many stitches remain, the way your body knows approximately how long, until the bell will ring. The candle flame leans suddenly to the left and then straightens again. This happens because someone has walked past the candle on their way to the night bucket, or perhaps because a draft has found its way through the crack under the door. The shadows on the wall lurch and settle, and your own shadow lurches and settles, and you see the movement from the corner of your eye without turning your head. The flame returns to its steady flickering, and the room returns to its steady quiet, and you return to the steady rhythm of your stitching. The linen has a smell. It smells of lye soap, and of the wooden chest where the shifts are stored, and of the body of the child who wears it, and of all the other bodies that have worn it before her. The smell is faint and clean, and it rises to your nose as you work, and you breathe it in, without thinking about it. The smell of clean linen is one of the good smells of this house, along with the smell of bread baking, and the smell of the wool after it has been sorted, and the smell of the rain when it falls on the packed earth of the kitchen yard. You do not have a list of good smells, but if you did, these would be on it. The callus on your right middle finger is where the needle rests when you push it through the fabric. The callus is small and hard, and it has been there for so long that you cannot remember a time when it was not there. It is the same color as the rest of your finger, but the texture is different, smoother and tougher, and it has no feeling in the very center where the needle presses most often. You rub the callus with your thumb sometimes when you are not sewing, and the sensation is strange because you can feel your thumb touching the callus, but the callus cannot feel your thumb. This is a small mystery that you have never solved, and you do not need to solve it, because mysteries are just things that are, and the callus is just a thing that is. The thread reaches its end. There is perhaps 3 inches left, and you know that this is not enough to continue because the last few inches are always difficult to pull through, and the stitches become uneven when the thread is too short. You make a small back stitch to secure the work, and then you bring the needle to the inside of the hem and make a loop with the remaining thread and pass the needle through the loop twice and pull it tight. This is the knot that will hold the thread in place, and it is a different knot from the one at the beginning, smaller and tighter and hidden between the layers of linen where no one will ever see it. You bite the thread to cut it because scissors are kept by the older girl, and asking for scissors would mean speaking, and speaking is not encouraged during evening work. The needle is empty now, and you hold it between your lips while you take a new length of thread from the small bundle in your lap. The needle tastes of steel and of the oil that keeps it from rusting, and the taste is familiar and not unpleasant. You thread the needle with the same motion you have used 1,000 times, holding the eye up to the candlelight and passing the end of the thread through with a steadiness that comes from long practice. The thread goes through on the first try, which does not always happen, and you feel a small satisfaction that is gone almost before you notice it. You make the overhand knot and test it with a tug, and then you insert the needle into the fabric just beyond the last stitch and begin again. The shadows have shifted while you were tying the knot. The candle has burned down slightly, and the flame is now a little lower, and the pool of light on the floor is a little smaller. The shadows of the children have grown longer, and they reach higher up the walls, and some of them have merged with the shadows of the ceiling beams, so that it is hard to tell where child ends and beam begins. You notice this because noticing small changes is what your mind does when there is nothing larger to notice, and the change in the shadows is the largest thing that has happened since you began sewing. The girl next to you is mending a tear in a woolen stocking. She is using a darning needle which is thicker than your needle and a strand of grey wool that matches the stocking almost exactly. Her work is slower than yours because darning is slower than hemming, and because the tear is in a place that is hard to reach, and she must hold the stocking stretched over her left hand while her right hand works the needle through the weave. You watch her for a moment without turning your head, and you see the concentration in her face, which is the same concentration that is in your face and in the faces of all the children in the circle. The concentration is not intense because nothing in this room is intense, but it is steady, and it fills the space behind the eyes and leaves no room for anything else. Your new thread is longer than the old one was, and you have many stitches ahead of you before it runs out. You settle back into the rhythm, and the rhythm carries you forward without effort, the way the current of a slow river carries a leaf. The needle goes down and up, and the thread follows, and the hem closes, and the undone section grows smaller by increments that are too small to see. You do not need to see the progress because you can feel it in the number of stitches you have made and the number of stitches that remain, and the feeling is enough. The candle needs trimming. You can tell because the flame has begun to flicker more than usual, and a thin stream of smoke is rising from the wick and curling toward the ceiling. The older girl notices too, and she sets down her sewing and walks to the candle with a small pair of snuffers that hang from a hook on the candle stand. She trims the wick with a single precise motion, and the flame brightens and steadies, and the smoke disappears. She returns to her chair and her sewing, and the room returns to its quiet, and you return to your stitches. The interruption was brief, and it changed nothing, but it was a break in the rhythm, and you noticed the return to rhythm more than you noticed the rhythm itself. The undone hem is now half its original length. You know this without measuring, because your body has kept track of the stitches, and your body knows that you have passed the midpoint. The remaining work is the same as the work you have already done, and there is no reason to hurry or to slow down or to do anything other than continue at the same steady pace until the work is finished. The linen is soft under your fingers, and the needle is smooth, and the thread is strong, and these three things are all you need for the next span of time. You think about the child who will wear this shift. She is small, and her name is Alice or Agnes, and she has brown hair that is always escaping from her cap, and she cries sometimes in the night when the bad dreams come. You do not know her well because you do not know anyone well in this house, but you know her face and her name and the sound of her crying, and these things are enough. She will wear this shift tomorrow, and she will not notice the mended hem, because hems are meant to be unnoticed, and the best mending is the mending that disappears into the fabric as if it was never there. You will know it is there, and that knowledge will be a small private thing that you carry with you through the next day, and then forget. The second thread runs out, and you tie the final knot, and bite the thread and examine the hem in the candlelight. The stitches are even and straight, and they hold the folded fabric firmly against the main body of the shift. The raw edge is completely enclosed, and it will not fray further, and the shift will last another season or perhaps two before the next hem gives way and someone else sits on this bench and mends it again. You fold the shift carefully and place it in the basket with the other mended garments, and you take the next item from the pile in front of you. The next item is another shift with another undone hem, and the work is the same, and the rhythm is the same, and the candle burns down another fraction of an inch. The evening continues, and you continue with it, and the shadows continue their slow migration across the walls, and the other children continue their own small tasks, and the house settles into the deep quiet that comes only at night, when the day's work is nearly done, and sleep is waiting just beyond the next bell. Your needle moves, and your fingers hold the fold, and your eyes watch the stitches appear one after another in a line that stretches toward the future, where you will do this again and again and again, because this is what evenings are for, and this is what your hands know how to do. The names in the parish register Sunday afternoon arrives with a different kind of stillness than the other days. The morning has been given over to the walk to the parish church, and the sitting on the hard wooden benches and the listening to words that drift over your head like the steam from the porridge pot. Words that you have heard so many times that they have become simply another texture of the week. You have walked back along the lane, and you have eaten the midday meal, which is the same as the evening meal, except there is sometimes a small piece of cheese, and you have waited through the hour of rest when you were allowed to sit on your pallet and do nothing. Now the rest hour is over, and the house is gathering for the weekly roll call and the reading of the parish register. The hall where the roll call happens is the same hall where you eat and where you mend and where you sit on cold evenings listening to the older girl read from a book that has no pictures. The benches have been pushed back against the walls, and the children stand in rows that form themselves without instruction because everyone knows where to stand. The youngest children stand in front where the overseer can see them clearly, and the older children stand behind, and you stand somewhere in the middle, where you have stood every Sunday since you were old enough to stand without being held. The stone floor is cold through your stockings, and you shift your weight from one foot to the other in a slow rhythm that matches the breathing of the child next to you. The overseer enters the hall carrying the register. The register is a large book bound in dark leather that has been polished by many hands over many years, and the leather has a sheen that catches the light from the high window. The book is heavy, and the overseer holds it with both hands against his chest as he walks to the small table that has been placed at the front of the room. He sets the book down with a soft thump that echoes slightly in the quiet, and then he opens it, and the sound of the cover lifting is a sound you know as well as the sound of the bell or the sound of the porridge ladle scraping the iron pot. The pages of the register are made of paper that is thick and slightly rough, and they make a dry rustling sound as the overseer turns them looking for the place where last Sunday's reading ended. The rustling sound fills the hall, and you listen to it because there is nothing else to listen to except the breathing of the children around you, and the distant sound of a crow somewhere beyond the garden wall. The overseer finds a mystery, and he smooths it flat with the palm of his hand, and then he looks up at the rows of children, and the children look back at him with faces that are still and waiting. The light from the high window falls across the table and onto the open book. The window faces south, and the afternoon sun is low enough now that the light comes in at an angle that turns the pages a warm yellowish color and makes the ink stand out dark against the paper. You can see the ink from where you stand, and you can see that it is brownish black, and that it has been laid down in a careful hand with letters that slope slightly to the right. You cannot read the words because you are too far away, and because reading is not something you have been taught, except for the simplest words from the hornbook that the older girl shows you sometimes. But you can see the shapes of the names, and the shapes are like the shapes of the cracks on the dormitory ceiling, familiar in their general form, but different in their specific details. The overseer begins to read. His voice is the same voice he uses for everything, a voice that is low and even, and without any particular rise or fall. The names come out of his mouth one after another, in a steady rhythm that is slower than the rhythm of the porridge eating and faster than the rhythm of the wool sorting. Each name is spoken clearly and completely, and there is a pause after each one. A pause that is just long enough for the child whose name has been called to make a small sound of acknowledgement. The sound is usually just a murmur or a clearing of the throat, or sometimes nothing at all if the child is very young and does not yet understand what is expected. You listen to the names as they pass through the air of the hall. Some of the names are names of children who stand in the rows around you, and you know their faces and their voices and the way they hold their spoons. Mary and Anne and Thomas and John and Alice, and Agnes and Sarah and William and the others whose names you have heard so many times that they have become like the sound of your own breathing, something that is always there and never noticed. When a name is called and the child answers, you feel a small shift in the room, a small confirmation that the name and the child still belong to each other. Some of the names belong to children who are no longer here. These names are read just the same as the others, with the same tone and the same pause. But there is no answering sound because the child has gone away to be apprenticed to the blacksmith or the weaver or the farmer in the next parish. The name hangs in the air for a moment, and then the overseer makes a small mark in the register with the quill that rests in the inkpot beside the book. The mark is a notation that you cannot see, but you know it is there because you have watched this ritual many times, and you understand that the register must be kept accurate even when the children have moved on. The sound of the quill scratching against the paper is a small sharp sound that cuts through the drone of the names and then fades. The brass clasp of the register catches the light and holds it. The clasp is the only bright thing in the room besides the window itself, and it gleams with a soft gold color that is almost warm. The clasp is shaped like a hand or perhaps a leaf, and it has been polished by the overseer's fingers every time he opens and closes the book. You watch the light move across the surface of the clasp as the overseer shifts his weight or turns a page, and the light changes from bright gold to dull brass and back again. The movement of the light is the only movement in the room besides the slow rise and fall of the children's chests as they breathe. Your own name is called. It comes out of the overseer's mouth and travels across the space between you, and it lands in your ears and you recognize it as your name, even though you do not think of yourself by your name very often. You make the small sound that is expected of you, a sound that is somewhere between a word and a breath, and the overseer's eyes move past you to the next child without pausing. Your name is written in the register, and it has been written there since you arrived, and it will remain written there until you leave. And after you leave, it will be marked in some way that you do not fully understand. The thought of your name existing on that page, even when you are no longer standing in this hall, is a thought that is too large for this moment, and it slides away from you like water off the oiled wool of your cloak. The reading continues. The names keep coming and you let them wash over you without trying to hold on to any particular one. The sound of the names becomes a kind of music, a music that has no melody and no rhythm except the rhythm of the overseer's breath and the turning of the pages. You notice that some names are longer than others, and some have sounds that are soft and some have sounds that are hard. Mary is soft and Thomas is harder, and your own name is somewhere in between. You have never thought about the texture of names before, but now you are thinking about it because there is nothing else to think about, and your mind needs something to do while your body stands still and your ears listen. The dust motes float in the shaft of light from the window. They are tiny and pale, and they move in slow spirals that are caused by the warmth of the room meeting the cold of the glass. You watch one particular mote as it drifts downward and then catches a current of air and rises again, and then drifts sideways into the shadow where it disappears. Another mote takes its place and follows a different path, and you watch this one too. The dust motes are always there in the light, and you have watched them during meals and during mending and during the long still hours of Sunday afternoons. They are like the names in the register, countless and individual and temporary, and they fill the space with a quiet presence that asks nothing and receives nothing. The overseer's voice has a slight wheeze today. You notice it because you have been listening to his voice for so long that any variation stands out the way a new crack in the ceiling stands out. The wheeze comes at the end of each name just before the pause, and it is a small sound like the sound of air being pushed through a narrow space. The overseer does not seem to notice it, and he continues reading in the same steady rhythm, and after a while the wheeze fades, or perhaps you stop noticing it because your ears have adjusted the way your eyes adjust to the dim light of the dormitory. The register contains more than just the names of the children. You know this because you have seen the overseer writing in it on other days when there are no children in the hall. The book holds the records of the parish, the births and the deaths and the marriages and the amounts of money given to the poor and the amounts of bread distributed in times of hardship. All of these things are written in the same careful hand with the same brownish-black ink, and they will remain in the book long after everyone named in it has been forgotten. The thought of all those names and all those events compressed into the pages of a single book is a thought that makes the book seem heavier than it already is, and you wonder if the overseer feels the weight when he carries it against his chest. A child in the front row shifts her weight and her shoe scrapes against the stone floor. The sound is small and brief, and the child freezes immediately, knowing that movement during roll call is discouraged. The overseer does not pause in his reading, and the moment passes and the room returns to its stillness. You feel the stillness in your own body, and you notice that your legs are beginning to ache from standing in one place for so long. The ache is in your calves and in the small of your back, and it is the same ache that you feel during the wool sorting and the mending and all the other tasks that require you to be still when your body wants to move. You shift your weight almost imperceptibly, and the ache moves to a different place, and you continue to stand and listen. The names of the children who have left are familiar to you, even though the children themselves are gone. There was a boy named Edward who went to the blacksmith last spring, and his name is still read every Sunday, and there is no answer. There was a girl named Margaret who went into service at the big house, and her name is read, and there is no answer. There were others whose names you have forgotten, but whose absence you remember in the way that you remember the shape of a stone that has been removed from the garden wall, leaving a gap that slowly fills with moss. The gaps in the roll call are like that stones that are no longer there, but whose absence is still part of the wall. The overseer turns a page, and the rustling sound fills the hall again. The new page looks the same as the old page, and the names continue in the same careful hand with the same brownish-black ink. You wonder if the ink smells of anything, and you realize that you have never been close enough to the register to smell it. The book smells of leather and old paper, and the faint mustiness of the cupboard where it is kept, and you know this smell because you have walked past the cupboard many times, and the smell seeps out through the crack around the door. The smell is not unpleasant, and it is the smell of things that are old and important and kept safe from the damp and the mice. The light from the window has moved while you were listening. The shaft of sunlight that was falling across the table has now shifted so that it illuminates the edge of the overseer's sleeve and the side of his face. His face is lined, and the lines are deep around his mouth and his eyes, and the light makes the lines look like the cracks in the plaster ceiling. He is not an old man, but he is not young either, and he has been reading these names for longer than you have been alive. You think about all the Sundays he has stood in this hall, and all the names he has spoken, and all the marks he has made in the register, and the thought is like the thought of the sea, something too large to hold on to for more than a moment. The reading is nearing its end. You can tell because the overseer's voice has taken on a slightly different quality, a quality of closing that you recognize from all the other Sundays. The last few names are spoken, and the last few children make their small sounds of acknowledgement, And then, the overseer closes the register, and the sound of the cover meeting the pages is a soft, heavy sound that signals the end of this part of the day. He places his hand on the cover, and he looks at the rows of children for a moment without speaking. Then he lifts the book and carries it back to the cupboard, and the children remain standing until he returns and dismisses them with a single word that is the same word every Sunday. You file out of the hall with the others, and your legs are stiff from standing, and the cold of the passage floor feels different after the relative warmth of the hall. The names are still echoing in your ears, or perhaps it is only the memory of the names, a memory that will fade before the evening meal. You will hear the names again next Sunday, and the Sunday after that, and every Sunday until you are one of the names that is read but not answered. The thought does not trouble you because it is just a fact, like the fact that the porridge is grey, or that the garden wall is made of flint and limestone. The register will continue and the names will continue, and you will stand in your row and listen, and the light will fall across the brass clasp, and the dust motes will drift in the shaft of sunlight. Everything will be the same as it has always been, and the sameness is the only comfort you know. The scrubbing of the oak floor. The morning after the roll call Sunday has faded into the grey of Monday, and the grey of Monday has brought with it the weekly task that occupies the hours between the morning porridge and the midday meal. This task is the scrubbing of the main hall floor, and it happens every Monday without exception, because the floor is made of oak, and oak requires a particular kind of care if it is to last for the generations of children who will walk across it long after you have gone. You have been assigned to the scrubbing crew this week, along with 3 other children of similar size, and the assignment is neither a punishment nor a reward. It is simply the next thing that needs to be done, and you are the hands available to do it. The hall has been emptied of its benches and tables, and they have been pushed against the walls of the passage, where they will wait until the floor is dry. The empty room seems larger than it does when it is full of children, and the sound of your footsteps echoes slightly as you walk across the boards carrying the wooden bucket that you have filled at the pump in the kitchen yard. The bucket is heavy, and the water sloshes against the sides with each step, and a few drops escape and land on the floor, where they sit in small beads that reflect the grey light from the high window. The water is cold because the pump draws from a well that is deep, and the coldness of the water will make your hands ache before the morning is over. But you do not think about this, because thinking about the cold does not make it less cold. You set the bucket down near the corner of the room where the scrubbing will begin. The other children are setting down their own buckets, and the older girl who supervises the Monday cleaning is distributing the scrubbing brushes and the cakes of the coarse soap that is made from lye and mutton fat and has a harsh, clean smell that stings the inside of your nose. The brush you are given has a wooden handle that is smooth from use, and bristles that are stiff and yellowed and worn down on one side where someone before you pressed harder with their right hand than their left. You turn the brush over in your hands and feel the weight of it and the way the handle fits into your palm, and you know that you will hold this brush for the next several hours, and that your hands will remember its shape long after you set it down. The sand is brought in a small wooden pail, and it is coarse grey sand from the stream that runs at the bottom of the pasture beyond the lane. The sand is damp, and it smells of cold water and wet stone, and it has small dark flecks in it that might be bits of slate or might be something else entirely. You take a handful of sand and let it run through your fingers, and the grains are sharp and irregular, and they catch against your skin in a way that is not quite painful, but is not comfortable either. The sand is the scrubbing agent, and it will work with the soap and the water and the bristles of the brush to lift the dirt from the grain of the wood, and leave the floor clean and pale and ready for another week of feet and spilled broth and the accumulated dust of a house full of children. The work begins on hands and knees. You lower yourself to the floor, and the boards are hard against your kneecaps through the thin wool of your stockings, and you know that by the end of the morning your knees will be sore and red, and that the soreness will linger into the afternoon wool sorting, and perhaps into the evening mending. The position is familiar because you have scrubbed this floor before, and you will scrub it again, and the familiarity does not make it more comfortable, but it does make it expected, and expectations are easier to bear than surprises. You arrange your bucket to your right and your sand pail to your left, and you dip the brush into the water and then rub it against the cake of soap until a thin grey lather begins to form among the bristles. The first section of floor is a single oak board that runs from the corner to the place where the next board begins. The board is wide, perhaps 12 inches across, and it is dark with the dirt of the previous week and the grain of the wood is visible only as a faint pattern of lines beneath the grey-brown film that covers everything. You sprinkle a handful of sand onto the board, and the sand lands with a soft, scattering sound, and you spread it with your fingers into a thin, even layer. Then you take the brush in both hands, and you press it down onto the sand, and you begin to scrub. The motion of scrubbing is a motion that involves your whole upper body. You push the brush forward, and the bristles scrape against the sand, and the sand scrapes against the wood, and the sound is a low grinding sound that fills the room along with the similar sounds from the other children working on their own sections. You pull the brush back and the sound changes, slightly becoming a little higher and a little sharper. Forward and back and forward and back, and each stroke moves the sand a small distance across the board, and with it moves the dirt that the sand has loosened from the grain. The water from the brush wets the sand and turns it into a grey slurry that spreads across the wood and darkens it temporarily before you push the slurry forward onto the next section. Your arms begin to feel the work almost immediately. The muscles in your shoulders and your upper arms are not used to this particular motion because you scrub floors only once a week, and the rest of your days are filled with different motions that use different muscles. The ache starts as a warmth that spreads outward from your shoulder blades, and then it becomes a dull burning that you recognize and accept, because accepting is what you do with all discomforts in this house. You continue scrubbing, and the motion becomes a rhythm, and the rhythm carries you forward across the board without requiring your mind to participate. Your body knows how to scrub, and your body will scrub until the board is clean, and then it will scrub the next board and the next. The slurry of sand and water and soap and dirt moves ahead of your brush in a slow wave. You watch the wave as it travels across the grain of the wood, and you notice how the water darkens the oak to a deep brown that is almost black in the places where the grain is tightest. The darkening is temporary, and you know this because you have watched it before. As the water evaporates or is wiped away, the wood will lighten again, returning to its natural color, which is a warm honey brown that glows faintly in the light from the window. But for now, the wood is dark and wet, and the darkness shows you exactly where you have scrubbed and where you have not. The dirt that you are removing is the accumulation of 7 days of life in this house. There is the fine grey dust that settles out of the air from the fires, and the wool sorting, and the constant small movements of many bodies. There are the crumbs from the bread that is eaten at the midday meal, and the occasional drop of broth that falls from a spoon. There is the mud that is tracked in on shoes from the kitchen yard, and the passage and the path to the privy. All of this has been ground into the grain of the oak by the pressure of feet walking back and forth across the hall, and now you are grinding it out again, with sand and water and the bristles of your brush. The work is the removal of 1 week, so that the next week can begin its own accumulation. You reach the end of the first board, and you sit back on your heels to examine what you have done. The board is clean or clean enough, and the water is beginning to dry at the edges where the scrubbing happened first. The drying wood is a lighter color than the wet wood, and the grain is now clearly visible as a pattern of wavy lines that run the length of the board with small knots and swirls where branches once grew from the trunk of the tree. The knots are darker than the surrounding wood, and they have a different texture, smoother and harder, and the sand has not scratched them in the same way it has scratched the softer grain around them. You run your finger over one of the knots, and the surface is like polished stone, cool and smooth, and slightly raised above the surrounding wood. The older girl walks past with a bucket of clean water, and she replaces your dirty bucket with a fresh one. The dirty water is grey and opaque, and there are small particles of sand and dirt suspended in it that settle slowly to the bottom when the bucket is set down. You watch the particles settle, and you think about how the water carries away the weak, and how the weak will be poured out onto the ground behind the kitchen where the wastewater goes, and how the ground will absorb it, and the dirt will become part of the soil, and the cycle will continue in ways that you cannot see and do not need to understand. The fresh water is clear and cold, and you dip your brush into it and feel the cold travel up the wooden handle and into your fingers. The second board is next to the first, and it is slightly narrower, and the grain runs in a different direction. The trees that became these boards were different trees that grew in different places, and they had different histories of sun and rain and wind. One tree grew straight, and its grain runs straight along the board. Another tree grew on a slope, and its grain curves gently to compensate for the angle of the ground. You can read these histories in the wood, the way you can read the cracks in the ceiling or the names in the register. The wood does not know that you are reading it, and it would not care if it did know. But the reading fills the time and gives your mind something to do while your body continues the slow repetitive work of scrubbing. The sand pail is running low, and you take another handful and sprinkle it across the second board. The sand is colder now because it has been sitting on the cold floor, and the coldness of the sand adds to the coldness of the water and the general coldness of the hall. Your fingers are red and the tips are wrinkled from the water, and the skin feels tight when you flex them. You make a fist and release it and make a fist again, and the movement warms your hands slightly, but the warmth fades as soon as you return to the scrubbing. The cold is just another part of the work, and you have learned to let it be there without giving it your full attention. The sound of the scrubbing fills the hall. 4 children on their hands and knees, with 4 brushes moving across 4 sections of floor, make a sound that is like the sound of the sea, if the sea were made of wood and sand instead of water and salt. The brushes scrape and grind and the water sloshes in the buckets, and the children breathe in their own separate rhythms, and occasionally one of them coughs or shifts position to ease the ache in their knees. The older girl walks among them, with her own brush doing the edges and the corners where the larger brushes cannot reach, and a brush makes a smaller, sharper sound against the boards. You listen to all these sounds, and they blend together into a single texture that is the texture of Monday morning in this house. The grain of the second board has a small crack near the center. The crack is narrow, and it runs for about 6 inches before it stops, and it has been there for as long as you can remember. Dirt and sand collect in the crack, and you must work the bristles of the brush into the narrow space to clean it out. You do this carefully because pressing too hard might widen the crack or splinter the wood, and then the crack would become a larger problem that someone would have to fix. The dirt comes out in small dark clumps that dissolve when you push the wet brush over them. The crack is now clean, and the wood on either side is pale and smooth, and the crack itself is a dark line that will fill again with dirt over the coming week. Your knees are sore now, properly sore, and the soreness has moved from a general ache to a specific pain in the points where your weight presses against the floor. You shift your position so that more of your weight rests on your left knee and less on your right, and the right knee feels a moment of relief before the left knee begins to complain. You will shift again in a few minutes, and then again. And this small dance of discomfort will continue until the scrubbing is finished. The other children are doing the same dance, and you can see them shifting and adjusting without ever fully stopping their work. The work continues regardless of the discomfort, and the discomfort continues regardless of the work, and the two things exist side by side like the sand and the water in the grey slurry that moves across the floor. The light from the high window has changed while you have been working. It is brighter now, and it falls across the section of floor that you have already scrubbed, showing the clean wood in all its detail. The clean wood is beautiful in a way that you do not have words for. It glows with a warm honey color, and the grain stands out in sharp relief, and the knots look like small dark islands in a pale sea. The beauty is temporary, because the floor will be walked on as soon as it is dry, and the dirt will begin to accumulate again immediately. But for this moment, the floor is clean, and the light is falling on it, and you can see what the wood looked like when it was first laid down by the men who built this house. The men are dead, and the trees are dead, and the house remains, and the floor remains, and you are here on your hands and knees cleaning it so that it will remain a little longer. The third board is wider than the first 2, and it has a large knot near the end that is shaped like a closed eye. You have noticed this knot before, and you have thought about it in the same way that you think about the chicken foot crack in the dormitory ceiling. The knot is dark brown, and it has concentric rings around it that spread outward like ripples in a pond. The wood around the knot is harder than the rest of the board, and the sand scratches against it without making much impression. You scrub the knot carefully, and the dirt comes away, and the dark brown becomes darker, and the rings become clearer, and the eye seems to look back at you with a gaze that is empty and patient and completely indifferent. The water in your bucket is grey again, and you carry it to the door where the older girl has placed a larger bucket for the dirty water. You pour your bucket into the larger bucket, and the water makes a splashing sound that echoes slightly in the empty hall. Then you go to the pump in the kitchen yard to fill your bucket again. The yard is cold, and the grey sky is low, and the garden wall is wet from a rain that fell during the night while you were sleeping. You pump the handle, and the water comes out in a rush, and you fill your bucket and carry it back inside, and the whole journey takes perhaps 2 minutes. and it is the only break you will have from the scrubbing until the floor is finished. The fourth board is the last board in your section, and it is next to the wall where the benches usually sit. The wood near the wall is darker than the rest of the floor because the benches block the light and the scrubbing, and the dirt accumulates in the shadows. You must scrub this section harder, and you must use more sand, and the slurry that forms is darker than the slurry on the other boards. The dark slurry spreads across the pale wood and you push it forward, and the contrast between the dirty water and the clean wood beneath is striking. You work slowly and carefully, and the dark slurry gradually lightens as the dirt is diluted by the clean water from your brush. By the time you reach the wall, the slurry is almost clear and the wood is clean, and you can see the place where the floorboards meet the stone of the wall, and the gap between them that is filled with a thin line of mortar. You sit back on your heels and look at the section of floor you have scrubbed. It is 4 boards wide and perhaps 10 feet long, and it is clean and wet and gleaming in the grey light from the window. The other children have finished their sections too, and the whole floor is clean and wet, and the hall smells of wet wood and lye soap and the faint mineral smell of the sand from the stream. The smell is a clean smell, and it fills your nose and your lungs, and it is the smell of Monday morning and the smell of work completed, and the smell of a house that is cared for by the hands of the children who live in it. The older girl walks the length of the hall inspecting the work. She looks at each section, and sometimes she points to a spot that needs more attention, and the child who scrubbed that section returns to it with their brush and scrubs until the spot is gone. She looks at your section and she does not point, and she moves on to the next, and you feel a small satisfaction that is gone almost before you notice it. The inspection is over, and the hall is clean, and the scrubbing is finished for another week. You stand up slowly because your knees and your back and your shoulders are stiff from the work. The standing is a sequence of small movements, and each movement brings a new awareness of the muscles you have been using. You carry your bucket and your brush and your sand pail to the passage, where they will be stored until next Monday. Then you go to the kitchen yard to empty the dirty water onto the ground, behind the kitchen, where the wastewater always goes. The ground is dark and wet, and the water soaks in quickly, leaving only a faint grey film on the surface of the soil. You watch the water disappear, and you think about how the dirt from the floor is now part of the earth, and how next week there will be more dirt and more water, and the cycle will continue. Your hands are red and wrinkled, and they ache with a deep ache that will fade by evening. You rub them together, and the friction warms them slightly, and you feel the roughness of the sand still clinging to your skin. You will wash your hands at the pump before the midday meal, but the sand will linger in the creases of your knuckles and under your nails, and you will carry a small piece of the Monday scrubbing with you into the rest of the week. The bell will ring soon for the midday porridge, and you will sit on the bench in the refectory, and you will hold your spoon in your red wrinkled hands, and you will eat, and the floor of the hall will dry slowly behind you, returning to its warm honey colour, and waiting for the feet that will walk across it, and the dirt that will accumulate, and the next Monday when you will kneel again, with sand and water, and brush and begin the work, once more. The pattern of the frost ferns. The cold arrives in the night like a second blanket laid over the first. But this blanket is made of stillness and silence rather than wool. You wake not because of any sound or movement, but because the temperature of the room has dropped below the point where sleep can hold you without effort. Your eyes open into the darkness, and the darkness is complete. And you know immediately that something is different even before your mind can name what that something is. The air against your cheeks is sharper than usual, and it carries a quality that you have learned to recognize over the winters of your life. A quality of absolute cold that comes only when the sky is clear, and the wind has died, and the earth is releasing the last of its warmth into the vast empty space above. You do not move at first because moving would disturb the warmth you have gathered under the blanket, and the warmth is more precious now than it was on ordinary nights. Mary's shoulder is pressed against yours, and her breathing is slow and deep, and you can feel the small movements of her body as she sleeps on without awareness of the cold. The other children are sleeping too, and their breathing makes the same soft chorus it always makes, but tonight the sound seems muted, as if the cold air itself is absorbing the noise and carrying it away into the darkness. You lie still and you listen, and you feel the cold pressing down from the ceiling and up from the floorboards and in from the walls until you are surrounded by it on all sides. Your nose is very cold. The tip of it feels as though it belongs to someone else. Someone who is standing outside in the kitchen yard rather than lying under a wool blanket in a room full of sleeping children. You bring your hand up slowly from under the blanket and you touch your nose with your fingertips, and the fingers are warm and the nose is cold, and the contrast is so sharp that you feel it as a small shock. You cover your nose with your hand and breathe warm air onto your fingers, and the warmth spreads into the cartilage and the skin, and for a moment the cold retreats. Then you put your hand back under the blanket and the cold returns immediately, and you accept this because the cold is not something you can fight. And fighting it would only make you more aware of it. The window is the source of the cold, or at least it is the place where the cold enters most directly. The window is set in the wall opposite your pallet, and you can see it now as a rectangle of slightly lighter darkness against the deeper darkness of the plaster. The glass is old and thin, and it offers almost no resistance to the temperature outside, and the air near the window is cold enough that you can feel it from across the room. You've been told that the glass keeps out the wind and the rain and the snow, and this is true. But it does not keep out the cold, and the cold seeps through the glass the way water seeps through the mortar of the garden wall. You watch the window and you wonder what is happening on the other side of the glass, and the wondering is enough to make you sit up slowly, carefully, so that the blanket stays wrapped around your shoulders. The floor is very cold against your bare feet, and you step quickly across the boards toward the window. The journey is only a few steps, but each step reminds you that the floor is frozen and that your stockings are thin and that the cold has penetrated every part of the house. You reach the window and you stand with the blanket pulled tight around you, and you look out into the night. The glass is covered with frost on the inside, and the frost is not a uniform coating, but a pattern, a complex, delicate pattern that catches what little light exists and holds it in 1,000 tiny refractions. The frost ferns have grown across the pane while you were sleeping. You call them ferns because that is what the older girl called them when she showed them to you last winter. And the name is fitting because the patterns do look like the leaves of ferns spreading outward from a central stem. Each fern begins at the bottom edge of the glass, where the cold is greatest, and it grows upward in a branching structure that becomes finer and more intricate as it reaches toward the top of the pane. The main stem is thick and white, and it divides into smaller stems, and those stems divide again and again until the very tips of the frost are so fine that they are barely visible even in the dim light. You lean closer to the glass and your breath fogs a small circle on the surface, and the fog obscures the frost for a moment before it clears. The clearing happens slowly, and the frost reappears from the edges of the circle inward until the pattern is whole again. You have learned not to breathe on the glass if you want to see the frost clearly, and so you hold your breath and you look at the details that are visible when the glass is cold and dry. The frost crystals are not white exactly, but a pale silvery grey that catches the faint light from the night sky and reflects it back in tiny points of brightness. The points of brightness shift as you move your head, and the whole pattern seems to shimmer slightly though. You know that it is perfectly still. The lead cane that holds the panes of glass together forms a grid across the window. The frost grows on the glass, but it stops exactly at the edge of the lead, as if the metal is a boundary that the crystals cannot cross. You have noticed this before, and it still fascinates you in the way that small, predictable things can fascinate a mind that has learned to find interest in the ordinary. The lead is dark against the pale frost, and the contrast makes the pattern of the ferns stand out more clearly. Each pane has its own fern, or sometimes several ferns that have grown independently, and the patterns are similar, but never identical, and you could spend a long time comparing one pane to another if the cold were not pressing against your face and reminding you that you are standing at a window in the middle of a frozen night. The largest pane is the one in the center, and it has the most elaborate frost pattern. The fern begins at the bottom left corner, where a small chip in the glass provides a starting point for the ice to form. From that point the main stem curves upward and to the right in a graceful arc, and from the stem branch smaller stems that spread outward in a repeating pattern. The branching follows rules that you can almost understand. Rules about angles and spacing, and the way that each new branch is slightly smaller than the one before it. The pattern is mathematical in its precision, and yet it feels organic, as if the frost is a living thing that has chosen this particular shape from all the possible shapes it could have taken. You know that the frost is not alive, and that it is only frozen water that has condensed from the air. But knowing this does not make the pattern any less beautiful or any less strange. The secondary panes have their own frost ferns, and you examine each one in turn. The pane on the left has a fern that grows straight upward from the bottom edge with almost no branching at all, just a single thick stem that narrows to a fine point near the top. The pane on the right has a fern that began in the middle of the glass and grew outward in all directions like a star or a flower, or the rays of the sun drawn by a child who has never seen the sun clearly. The top panes are smaller, and their frost is simpler, just a few delicate fronds that have spread across the glass in patterns that remind you of the veins in a leaf, or the cracks in the plaster ceiling. You look at all these patterns, and you let your eyes move from one to another without hurry, because there is no hurry in the middle of a frozen night. The cold has found its way through the blanket, and it is pressing against your shoulders and your back and your bare feet on the floorboards. You shift your weight and pull the blanket tighter, and you know that you should return to your pallet and burrow under the wool and wait for morning. But the frost ferns are still growing, and you can see the growth if you look very carefully. The tips of the smallest branches are extending outward by tiny increments, and the spaces between the branches are filling with finer and finer crystals that form a background of delicate lace. The growth is too slow to see in the moment, but if you look away and then look back, you can see that the pattern has changed. The fern has become more complex, and the spaces have become smaller, and the whole pane of glass is moving toward a state of complete coverage where no clear glass remains. You think about the water that is becoming frost. The water was in the air of the dormitory, released by the breathing of 14 sleeping children, and it has been wandering through the room looking for a place to settle. It found the cold glass, and it changed from invisible vapor to visible ice. And the change happened according to rules that you do not fully understand. The water molecules arranged themselves into crystals, and the crystals grew in the direction of the cold, and the pattern they formed was determined by the temperature and the humidity and the tiny imperfections on the surface of the glass. All of this happened without anyone watching and without anyone intending it. And the result is a work of art that will disappear as soon as the sun rises and warms the glass above the freezing point. The window in the far corner has a different kind of frost. Instead of ferns, it has a pattern that looks like feathers, or perhaps like the overlapping scales of a fish. The crystals are smaller and more densely packed, and they form a surface that is almost opaque, a surface that glows faintly in the darkness like a sheet of thin ice on a pond. You walk to that window and you examine the feather frost, and you see that it is made of countless tiny crystals, all aligned in the same direction, and the alignment creates a texture that is different from the fern frost. You run your finger along the edge of the glass where the frost is thinnest, and the crystals melt under your touch and leave a trail of clear glass that will soon freeze over again. The touch is cold and wet, and you wipe your finger on the blanket and return your hand to the warmth beneath. The night outside the window is clear and still. Through the gaps in the frost you can see a portion of the sky, and the sky is black and full of stars that you rarely see, because the dormitory window is usually fogged with condensation or covered with the grey of clouds. Tonight the stars are sharp and bright, and they seem closer than usual, as if the cold has pulled them down toward the earth. You find the group of stars that the older boy called the plough, and you trace its shape with your eyes, and you think about how the same stars are shining on the fields and the village and the parish church and all the places you have never been. The thought is too large, and it slips away from you, and you return your attention to the frost, which is smaller and closer and easier to understand. The lead cane is cold, and you touch it with one finger. The metal is colder than the glass, and the cold travels up your finger and into your hand, and you pull away quickly. The lead is the framework that holds the window together, and it has been there since the window was made by hands that are now dust. The lead has a purpose, and the glass has a purpose, and the frost has no purpose at all. The frost is just something that happens when the conditions are right, and it asks nothing of anyone, and it serves no function except to be beautiful in the darkness when no one sees it. You are seeing it now, and the seeing is a small private thing that belongs only to you and to the cold and to the night. Your feet are numb now, and you can no longer feel the floorboards beneath them. The numbness is not painful, but it is a warning, and you know that you should return to your pallet before the cold does more than numb your skin. You take one last look at the frost ferns, and you notice a detail that you had not seen before. At the very edge of the center pane, where the frost meets the lid, there is a tiny crystal that has grown in a perfect six-sided shape like the star on the overseer's book. The crystal is so small that you must lean very close to see it, and your breath would fog the glass if you breathed. But you do not breathe, and you look at the perfect geometry of the frozen water, and you feel something that might be wonder, if wonder were allowed in this house. You walk back to your pallet, and your feet leave faint damp prints on the floorboards that will freeze into small patches of ice before morning. You lower yourself under the blanket, and Mary shifts in her sleep, and the warmth of her body reaches out to meet the cold of yours. The warmth spreads slowly from the point where your shoulders touch, and it moves outward into your arms, and your chest and your stomach, and finally your feet, which begin to ache as the blood returns to them. The ache is sharp, and then dull, and then gone, and you lie still, and you listen to the breathing of the other children, and you think about the frost ferns that are still growing on the window glass. The ferns will be there when the first light comes. They will be at their most beautiful in the grey dawn, when the light is strong enough to illuminate every crystal, but not strong enough to melt them. You will see them again when you wake, and you will watch them disappear as the sun climbs higher and the glass warms. The ferns will retreat from the edges inward, and the delicate tips will dissolve first, and then the smaller branches, and finally the main stems will collapse into droplets of water that run down the glass and pool on the wooden frame. By the time the bell rings for the morning porridge, the frost will be gone, and the window will be clear and wet, and the night's work of cold and stillness will be erased, as if it had never happened. But you will remember the ferns. You will carry the image of them in your mind through the day, and perhaps through the next night, and perhaps through all the nights until the next deep cold arrives and the ferns grow again. The memory will fade eventually, the way all memories fade in this house. But for now, it is yours, and you hold it under the blanket with the warmth of your own body, and the warmth of Mary's shoulder, and the sound of 14 children breathing in the frozen dark. The night continues, and the cold continues, and the frost ferns continue their slow invisible growth on the glass. You close your eyes, and you let the rhythm of the breathing carry you back towards sleep, and the last thing you see behind your eyelids is the pattern of the frost, a pattern that is intricate and delicate and temporary and completely without purpose, except to be seen by someone who woke in the cold and walked to the window and looked. The turning of the great wheel. The afternoon has settled into its familiar shape, and you have been released from the wool sorting an hour earlier than usual, because the older girl who works the great wheel has asked for someone to sit with her and keep her company while she spins. The request is not a request exactly, because nothing in this house is requested or granted in the way that things are asked for and given in the world outside. It is simply an arrangement that has been made by the older girl who supervises the wool room, and you have been chosen for no particular reason that you can discern. You are the right size to sit on the low stool, and you are quiet, and you do not fidget, and these qualities are enough. The spinning room is a small room off the wool room, and it has a single window that faces east and catches the morning light. But by afternoon, the light has moved on, and the room is dim and warm. The warmth comes from the small brazier that burns in the corner, with a few lumps of coal that glow red and orange and give off a steady heat that is different from the heat of the kitchen fire. The spinning room is the warmest room in the house during the winter months, because the wool spins better when it is warm, and because the older girl who works the wheel has earned the privilege of warmth through years of skillful labor. You sit on the low stool near the brazier, and the heat washes over your left side, while your right side remains cool, and the contrast is pleasant in a way that you have no words for. The great wheel is not actually great in the sense of being large compared to other things in the world. It is great only in comparison to the smaller wheels that are used for finer work, and it stands about as tall as your shoulder when you are sitting, and perhaps as tall as your chest when you are standing. The wheel is made of oak that has darkened with age, and with the oil from countless hands, and the wood has a sheen that catches the red light from the brazier and reflects it back in warm tones. The wheel is mounted on a sturdy frame that holds it upright, and the frame has 4 legs that are splayed for stability, and the legs are worn on the bottom, where they have been dragged across the stone floor for more years than you have been alive. The older girl sits on a stool that is higher than yours, and she faces the wheel with her back straight and her feet placed precisely on the treadle that drives the mechanism. Her name is Sarah, or perhaps it is something else that you have forgotten, but she is called Sarah by everyone, and she answers to it without complaint. She is older than you by perhaps 6 or 7 years, and she will leave the house next spring to go into service at the big house where she will spin fine thread for the ladies' linens. You know this because she has told you, and because everyone knows the destinations of the older children, the way everyone knows the cracks in the ceiling and the names in the register. Sarah's hands are the hands of someone who has spun wool every day for most of her life, and they move with a certainty that yours will never have. The wheel begins to turn. Sarah presses down on the treadle with her right foot, and the motion travels up through a wooden rod and into the axle of the great wheel, and the wheel responds by rotating in a smooth, steady circle. The wheel is large, and it has 8 spokes that radiate from the central hub to the outer rim, and the spokes are turned on a lathe so that they are round and smooth, and they taper slightly toward the center. The rim of the wheel is made of bent wood that has been joined at a perfect circle, and it is grooved to hold the drive band, which is a continuous loop of twisted linen that runs from the great wheel to the small pulley on the spindle assembly. You watch the spokes as they pass through the top of their arc and descend again, and the motion is so smooth that the individual spokes blur together into a single continuous shape that is not quite solid and not quite transparent. The sound of the wheel is a sound that you have heard in the background of your days for as long as you have been in this house. It is a soft whirring sound that rises and falls slightly with each revolution, and it is joined by the creak of the treadle and the occasional click of the flyer mechanism that twists the wool into thread. The whirring is not loud enough to be noticed unless you are listening for it, and you are listening for it now because there is nothing else to listen to in the warm, dim room. The sound fills your ears and your mind, and it pushes out the other sounds that usually occupy your attention. And for a while there is nothing but the wheel and the whirring and the slow, steady rotation of the spokes. Sarah's hands are doing something that you cannot fully see because the motion is too quick and too practiced. Her left hand holds a long piece of roving, which is the wool that has been carded and aligned into a soft, loose cylinder of fibers. The roving is draped over her left wrist, and it feeds into her fingers where she controls the amount of wool that enters the twist. Her right hand is near the spindle, and it pinches and releases the emerging thread in a rhythm that matches the rotation of the wheel. The thread winds onto the bobbin and the bobbin fills slowly, and the whole process is a coordination of foot and hand and eye that you watch without understanding. You do not need to understand because watching is enough, and because the watching fills the afternoon in the same way that the wool sorting fills the afternoon, and the mending fills the evening. The wheel has a squeak. You've noticed this squeak before when you have passed by the spinning room door and heard the wheel turning within. The squeak comes at a particular point in each revolution, and you begin to count the revolutions without meaning to. 1 revolution and then another, and then another. And on the 7th revolution the squeak comes again, a small high sound that is almost musical. You count 7 more revolutions, and the squeak returns, and you realize that the squeak is caused by a specific spoke, or perhaps by a specific point on the drive band, or perhaps by a bent nail in the treadle mechanism that you cannot see from your stool. The cause does not matter, and the regularity of the squeak does matter because it gives a structure to the sound of the wheel, and a structure is something your mind can hold on to while the rest of your attention drifts. 7 revolutions and a squeak. 7 revolutions and a squeak. The pattern repeats, and you let it carry you forward into a state that is not quite sleep and not quite waking. Your eyes are open and you are watching the wheel and the spokes, and Sarah's hands and the red glow of the brazier. But your mind has detached itself from the need to understand or to remember, or to do anything other than exist in the warm, dim room with the sound of the wheel. This state is familiar to you because you've entered it many times before during the wool sorting and the mending and standing in the kitchen yard looking at the garden wall. It is the state that comes when a task is repetitive enough and undemanding enough that the mind can let go of its grip on the present and float in a kind of gentle emptiness. The bobbin is filling with thread. The thread is a pale grey that is almost white, and it winds onto the wooden core in tight, even layers that build up slowly. Sarah stops the wheel occasionally to adjust something or to add more roving or to check the tension of the drive band. The stopping is abrupt, and the silence that follows is startling after the long whirring. Then the wheel begins again, and the sound returns and the spokes resume their blur, and the squeak comes back on the 7th revolution. You notice that the squeak is slightly different after each stop, as if the wheel needs a moment to settle back into its familiar rhythm. Then it finds the rhythm, and the squeak returns to its regular place, and the pattern reasserts itself. Sarah's face is calm and distant. She's not looking at the wheel, or at the thread, or at you. Her eyes are focused on something that is not in the room, or perhaps on nothing at all, and her expression is the expression of someone whose body is working while her mind is elsewhere. You recognize this expression because you have worn it yourself during the long hours of wool sorting and floor scrubbing. It is the expression of surviving repetition by leaving the present moment and traveling to a place where time moves differently. Sarah is in that place now, and you are in that place with her, and the wheel is the bridge between the two of you, and the sound of the wheel is the only thing that holds you both in the warm, dim room. The light from the window has changed while you have been watching. The east-facing window catches only the reflected light of the afternoon sky, and the sky has deepened to a darker grey that means evening is approaching. The red glow of the brazier becomes more prominent as the natural light fades, and the shadows in the corners of the room grow longer and softer. Sarah does not seem to notice the change, and her hands continue their work, and the wheel continues its turning, and the squeak continues its 7-revolution cycle. You notice the change because noticing small changes is what your mind does, and the change in the light is the largest thing that has happened since you sat down on the low stool. You think about the thread that is forming on the bobbin. The thread is made of the same wool that you salted yesterday, or perhaps the day before, and your hands touched these same fibers when they were still tangled and full of seeds and vegetable matter. Now the fibers have been carded and aligned, and they are being twisted into a continuous strand that will become cloth, and the cloth will become clothing, and the clothing will be worn by someone in this house, or perhaps sold in the village for money that will buy flour and salt and the other things that keep the house running. The thread is a connection between your work and Sarah's work and the work of everyone in the house, and the connection is invisible. But it is real in the way that the squeak is real, and the spokes are real. The 7th revolution comes, and the squeak sounds, and you let the sound wash over you without counting what comes next. You have lost track of how many cycles have passed since you began watching, and the losing of track is a kind of freedom. The wheel turns and the spokes blur, and Sarah's hands move and the bobbin fills, and all of these things are happening at once, and none of them require anything from you. You are a point of stillness in a room of motion, and the motion flows around you like water around a stone, and you are content to be the stone. Sarah stops the wheel again, and this time she reaches for a fresh bobbin. The old bobbin is full, and she removes it carefully and sets it in a basket with other full bobbins that will be taken to the weaving room tomorrow. The new bobbin is empty, and it slides onto the spindle with a soft click, and Sarah adjusts the drive band and checks the tension, and then she presses the treadle and the wheel begins to turn once more. The first revolution is slow and hesitant, and then the wheel finds its rhythm and the whirring returns and the squeak returns on the 7th revolution. You watch the new bobbin begin to fill, and the thread is the same pale grey as before, and the work is the same as before, and the afternoon continues. Your back is beginning to ache from sitting on the low stool. The stool has no back, and you must hold yourself upright with your own muscles, and the muscles grow tired after a while. You shift your weight, and the ache moves to a different place, and you settle into the new position, and the wheel continues to turn. The ache is familiar, and it joins the other sensations of the room, the warmth of the brazier on your left side, and the coolness of the air on your right side, and the sound of the wheel, and the sight of the spokes. All of these things exist together, and you exist among them, and the afternoon passes in the way that afternoons always pass in this house, which is to say slowly and completely and without any mark to show where 1 hour ended and the next began. You think about the wheel itself and how it was made. Somewhere a wheelwright selected a piece of oak and shaped it with tools that you have never seen, and fitted the spokes and joined the rim and balanced the whole thing so that it would turn true. The wheelwright is probably dead now, and the tree is definitely dead, and the wheel remains, and it will remain after Sarah leaves, and after you leave, and after all the children now sleeping in the dormitory have gone to their various fates. The wheel does not care who turns it, and it does not care who watches it turn. The wheel is only a wheel, and its purpose is to turn, and to make thread from wool, and to fill the warm, dim room with its steady, whirring sound. The squeak comes and goes and comes again. You have stopped counting the revolutions, but your body has not stopped noticing the pattern. Your breathing has fallen into a rhythm that matches the wheel, and your heartbeat has slowed to match the rhythm of the treadle. You are not asleep, but you are not fully awake either, and the state is pleasant in a way that you will not remember later. The wheel turns and the spokes blur, and Sarah's hands move and the red glow of the brazier pulses slightly with each breath of air that finds its way through the crack under the door. The afternoon is endless, and you are content for it to be endless. Sarah speaks without looking at you. Her voice is low, and it blends with the sound of the wheel so that you must lean forward slightly to hear her. She says something about the wool and the weather and the price of thread in the village, but the words are not important, and you let them pass over you the way you let the names in the register pass over you. She is not speaking to you exactly, but to the room and to the wheel, and to the long afternoon that she is filling with her work. You make a small sound of acknowledgement, and she continues speaking, and the wheel continues turning, and nothing changes. The bell will ring soon for the evening meal. You know this the way you always know when the next thing is about to happen. The light has reached a particular shade of grey, and your stomach has begun to make small sounds, and Sarah's movements have taken on a quality of winding down, though she will continue spinning until the exact moment the bell rings. You watch the wheel and you listen to the squeak, and you wait for the bell with the same patience that you bring to all the waitings of your life. The wheel turns and the afternoon ends and the evening begins, and you will carry the memory of the whirring sound into the refectory and into the dormitory and into your sleep. The great wheel will be here tomorrow, and Sarah will be here tomorrow, and you may be here tomorrow, or you may be somewhere else, but the wheel will turn regardless, and the squeak will come on the 7th revolution, and the thread will wind onto the bobbin in its tight, even layers. This is the way of things, and you accept it the way the wheel accepts the drive band and the wool accepts the twist. The settling of the dust. The evening meal is over, and the bowls have been washed, and the spoons have been counted and returned to their wooden box, and the night bucket has been placed behind the screen in the passage. You have walked through these last hours of the day in the same way you walk through all the hours, which is to say, without hurry and without resistance, and with the quiet attention that comes from knowing exactly what will happen next. The refectory has been swept, and the benches have been pushed against the walls, and the candle has been extinguished, and the smell of broth and bread lingers in the air for a while, before fading into the general smell of the house, which is a smell of wool and wood, and the faint mustiness of old plaster. The passage is dark now, with only the thin line of light from under the overseer's door to show where the floor ends and the wall begins. You walk with the others in the familiar line, and your feet find the warm places on the boards without your eyes needing to guide them. The passage walls are the same pale grey. They have always been, though. In the darkness, they are simply darkness, and the texture of the plaster is something you feel through the air rather than see with your eyes. You have walked this passage so many times that the journey from the refectory to the dormitory is not a journey at all, but a single continuous state of being that begins at the refectory door and ends at the dormitory threshold. The dormitory receives you with the same indifference it has shown every night since you arrived. The room is cold in the way that all rooms in this house are cold once the sun has gone and the fires have been banked for the night. The cold is not the sharp cold of the frost-fern night, but the ordinary cold of a winter evening in a house that was built before anyone thought to keep the warmth inside. You accept the cold the way you accept the weight of the blanket and the sound of the other children breathing, and you walk to your pallet, which is in the same place it has always been. The pallet is made of straw that has been crushed flat by many nights of sleeping, and it rustles softly when you sit down on it. The straw smells of dust and of the fields where it grew, and of all the bodies that have lain on it before yours. You do not think about these bodies because thinking about them would require a kind of attention that you are not giving to this moment. You are giving your attention to the small tasks of preparing for sleep, which are the same tasks you performed last night and will perform tomorrow night and every night until you leave this house. Your shoes are the first thing you remove. They are made of leather that was once brown, but has darkened to a deep grey-black from wear and weather. The leather is stiff and cold, and your fingers work the laces loose with the same motions they have used 1,000 times. The laces are made of twisted hemp, and they have knots in them where they broke and were tied back together. You set the shoes beside your pallet with the toes pointing toward the wall and the heels toward the center of the room. This is the way everyone sets their shoes, and you do it without thinking, because it is the way it is done. Your stockings come next, and they are wool, and they are grey, and they have holes in the heels where the friction of your shoes has worn through the fibers. You will mend these holes on some future evening, or perhaps someone else will mend them after you've gone. The stockings are damp from the day, and they smell faintly of your feet and of the wool itself, and you lay them across the foot of your pallet where they will dry slightly in the night air, though they will never dry completely. Your feet are pale in the dim light, and you look at them for a moment without really seeing them. They are your feet, and they have carried you through this day, and they will carry you through tomorrow. The shift you wear is the same shift you've worn all day, and it will be the same shift you wear tomorrow, because there are only 2 shifts for each child, and the other one is being washed or mended or waiting in the wooden chest. You do not remove the shift because the night is cold, and because sleeping in your shift is what everyone does. You simply loosen the ties at the neck, and you lie down on the pallet, and you pull the grey wool blanket up to your chin. The blanket is rough against your skin, and it smells of sheep and of all the nights you have slept under it, and the smell is the smell of safety, or something like safety, something like the absence of danger. Mary is beside you as she always is. Her shoulder finds yours under the blanket, and the warmth of her body begins to seep across the small space between you. She does not speak, and you do not speak, because speaking after the candle is snuffed is not dumb. The silence is not a rule exactly, but a habit that has formed over so many nights that breaking it would feel like breaking something important. You lie still and you listen to the sounds of the other children settling into their own pallets, and the sounds are the same sounds they were last night. The rustle of straw and the soft thump of bodies finding comfortable positions, and the occasional cough that is quickly suppressed. The ceiling is above you in the darkness. You cannot see it, but you know it is there because you have seen it every morning and every night, for as long as you have been in this house. The cracks are there too, and you trace them in your mind without needing to see them. The chicken-foot riverbed mat crack runs from the corner above the door to the center of the room, where it forks into 2 smaller cracks. The Britain stain is in the corner above the window where the roof leaked 3 winters ago. The new crack that you noticed this morning is a hairline fissure that runs from the window frame toward the stain, and you wonder if it has grown during the day. You will check tomorrow morning when the light returns, and you will see if the crack is longer or wider, and you will add this information to the map you keep in your mind. The breathing of the other children is a sound that you know as well as you know the sound of your own heart. The youngest child on the end breathes fast and light like a small bird that has flown a long way and is resting. The older boy near the door breathes slow and heavy with a slight rasp that he has had all winter. Mary breathes in her 3/4 pattern, and you breathes in your own pattern, which you cannot hear. The combined sound of all these breaths is the sound of the house at night, and it is a sound that never stops and never changes. You listen to it, and you let it fill your ears and your mind. And after a while, you stop hearing it as separate breaths, and hear it only as a single continuous sound, like the sound of the great wheel or the sound of the rain on the roof. The dust is settling. You cannot see the dust because the room is dark, but you know it is there because dust is always there in a house full of wool and straw and children. During the day, the dust is stirred up by the movement of bodies and the sweeping of floors and the opening and closing of doors. At night, when everything is still, the dust settles slowly back onto the surfaces, where it will wait until tomorrow's movement stirs it up again. The dust settles on the floorboards and the window ledges and the plaster ceiling and the grey wool blankets. It settles on your face and your hands and in your hair, and you do not notice it because it is just another texture of the life you live. You think about the day that is ending. It began with the grey light in this same room, and it continued through the porridge and the wool sorting and the standing in the kitchen yard and the mending and the roll call and the scrubbing and the watching of the frost ferns and the turning of the great wheel. All of these things happened, and now they are over, and tomorrow they will happen again in a slightly different order, or with slightly different details. The porridge will be the same grey, and the wool will be the same grey, and the garden wall will be the same grey, and the garden wall will be the same grey. The only things that change are the small things that only you notice, and even those changes are so small that they barely count as changes at all. Mary shifts beside you and her shoulder presses more firmly against yours. The pressure is warm and steady, and it grounds you in your body and in the present moment. You are here, on this pallet, in this room, in this house, and there is nowhere else you need to be. The thought is not a happy thought or a sad thought. It is simply a true thought, and you hold it for a moment before letting it go. The darkness is complete, and the silence is complete except for the breathing and the distant scratch of the mouse in the wall. The mouse is still there, and it will be there for weeks more, because the cat is old and fat and no longer interested. The warmth under the blanket is growing slowly. It spreads from the point where your shoulder touches Mary's, and it moves outward into your arm and your chest and your stomach. Your feet are still cold, and they will probably remain cold until morning, but the rest of you is warm enough, and the warmth is a small comfort in the long, cold night. You curl your toes inside your stockings, and the movement creates a tiny pocket of warmer air that fades almost immediately. You do this again, and the repetition is soothing in the way that all repetition is soothing. The bell will ring in the morning. It will ring at the same time it always rings, and you will rise and fold your blanket and walk to the refectory and eat your porridge. The day will unfold in its familiar sequence, and you will move through it with the same quiet attention you have brought to every day. The wall will need sorting, and the floor will need sweeping, and the hems will need mending. The garden wall will be there, and the frost ferns may appear again if the night is cold enough. The great wheel will turn, and the squeak will come on the 7th revolution. All of this will happen, and you will be there to see it and to hear it and to feel it in your hands and your feet and the ache in your back. You close your eyes, and the darkness behind your eyelids is the same as the darkness in the room. There is no difference between the two, and you cannot tell where the room ends and your mind begins. The breathing of the other children continues, and you let it carry you towards sleep the way the current of a slow river carries a leaf. You are not fighting the current, and you are not swimming against it. You are simply floating, and the floating is easy and undemanding. The day is over, and the night is here, and the night will pass in the same way all nights pass, which is to say slowly and completely and without any mark to show where 1 hour ended and the next began. The ceiling cracks are invisible now, but they are still there. They will be there when you wake, and they will be there when you leave this house, and they will be there for the next child who sleeps on this pallet and looks up at the plaster in the grey morning light. The cracks do not care who looks at them, and they do not care if anyone looks at them at all. They are simply cracks, and their purpose is to exist and to mark the slow settling of the house into the earth. The house is old, and it is still settling, and it will be settling long after everyone now sleeping within its walls has gone to their various fates. You think about the register and the names written in it. Your name is there among all the other names, and it will be read next Sunday, and the Sunday after that. One day your name will be read, and there will be no answer, because you will have gone to the blacksmith, or the weaver, or the farm in the next parish. The register will record your leaving with a small mark in brownish black ink, and then the next name will be read, and the next child will make their small sound of acknowledgement. The cycle will continue, and you will be part of the cycle even after you have left, because the register remembers, even when people forget. The dust settles on the register too. It settles on the leather cover, and on the brass clasp, and on the pages where the names are written. The overseer will wipe the dust away when he opens the book on Sunday, but by Monday the dust will have begun to settle again. The dust is patient, and it does not hurry. It falls at its own pace, and it covers everything equally without preference or distinction. The dust falls on the children and the wool and the porridge bowls and the great wheel. It falls on the garden wall and the frost ferns and the mended hens. It falls on you, and you do not feel it, because you are already covered in it, and have been covered in it since the day you arrived. Your breathing has slowed to match Mary's breathing. You did not decide to do this, and you did not notice it happening. But it has happened, and now your breath and her breath are moving in the same 3-4 pattern. The synchronization is temporary, and it will break when one of you shifts, or coughs, or enters a deeper stage of sleep. But for now, you are breathing together, and the sound of your combined breath joins the sound of all the other breaths in the room. The sound is the sound of the house at rest, and it is the only sound that matters. The night deepens. The cold deepens with it, and you pull the blanket a little higher until it covers your chin completely. The wool is rough and warm, and it holds the smell of all the nights you have slept under it. You breathe in the smell, and you let it fill your nose and your lungs. The smell is the smell of safety, or something like safety, and it is enough. The room is dark, and the ceiling is invisible, and the cracks are waiting for the morning light. The other children are sleeping, and you are sleeping, or nearly sleeping. The boundary between waking and sleeping is so thin that you cannot feel yourself cross it. The last thing you are aware of before sleep takes you completely is the texture of the blanket against your chin and the warmth of Mary's shoulder against yours and the sound of 14 children breathing in the dark. These things have been here every night, and they will be here every night to come. They are the constants of your life, and you hold on to them without knowing that you are holding on to anything. The day is over, and the night is here, and the night will pass. Tomorrow will be the same as today, and today was the same as yesterday. This is not a tragedy, and it is not a comfort. It is simply the way things are, and you accept it the way the floor accepts the dust and the wool accepts the twist, and the house accepts the slow passage of the years. The dust settles. The breathing continues. The night holds everything in its dark embrace. You sleep.